In the hush of evening, when the Nile settles into its slow breathing and the sandstone of temple walls holds the day's warmth, the world of Egypt narrows to a single thought order. The stars lean close. The river glints like a strip of hammered metal. And behind closed doors, those who rule remember that their bodies are not entirely their own. Here, intimacy is not a private comfort. It is ceremony. It is oath. It is the quiet work by which a kingdom keeps its balance. The pharaoh does not stand apart from this order. He embodies it. In the stories carved across lintels and pylons, he is not merely chosen by the gods. He is described as one of them, an earthly vessel through whom the realm is steadied. Because of this, acts that elsewhere belong to shadow and secrecy move into the lamplight of ritual. What would in another culture be called desire here takes the shape of duty. The beliefs that hold this world together are old and unmarred by doubt. The union of Isis and Osiris is not distant myth. It is patterned to be repeated for the land to thrive. The birth of Horus is not closed by time. It is reenacted to prove that sovereignty still flows from the same source. The temple inscriptions do not blush. They speak with certainty, tying the king's flesh to the seasons, and the sky to the grain bent under wind, to the low swell of the river that nourishes the fields. In such a system, a touch can be a vow, and a breath can be a sign that the cosmos remains aligned. Inside, the palace chambers are arranged with this certainty in mind. Floors are cool and even. Linen is kept smooth as water. Bowls of oil are readied not for indulgence, but for rites that must proceed without falter. When the king crosses a threshold, the shift is almost imperceptible but absolute. The language of counsel recedes. The language of service begins. Attendance is silent movements are measured, and the air carries the mingled scents of incense and lotus, as if to say that what happens next belongs to the gods as much as to any human wish. To the people beyond the walls, the pharaoh's presence in festivals and on temple reliefs is proof enough of his nearness to divinity. But within these rooms, the proof is quieter, steadier. The body itself becomes the medium of faith. When the king stands beneath painted stars and hears the first murmur of a priest's intonation, he is being returned to a role older than his name. He is not there to seek his own comfort. He is there to assure the world that beginnings can still be called forth. Because the king is bound to this order, the women around him are drawn into its current. Their titles and ranks shape how they appear in public, but within sanctified spaces, those distinctions soften into a single expectation that each gesture contributes to balance. A sister's presence at a rite may answer the demand for continuity. A priestess's stillness may answer the demand for sacred imitation. The forms vary, the aim does not. The rituals must be performed with care, no hurried motions, no stray words, nothing that might loosen the knot tying heaven to earth. Even speech has edges here. The terms used by scribes to record these matters are chosen for weight, not warmth. A union may be called, complete a rite successful, a blessing affirmed. The language is dry because its subject is not the inner life of the king, but the outer life of the kingdom. This tone makes the scenes on stone feel distant, yet the bodies they describe are undeniably near, arms lifted according to instruction, eyes lowered, steps counted. These are not tales of private rooms, they are instructions for keeping the season steady. In this frame, modesty does not mean concealment, it means purpose. Drapery is set aside not to provoke, but to prevent friction with ceremony. Oil is applied to ease movement, not to entice it. A hush is maintained so that the chant low and continuous can be the single river that carries the act from first touch to final seal. If the rite echoes a myth, the echo must be clear. If the rite blesses the land, no gesture must blur its intent. The king's role within these acts contains a paradox, that the culture accepts without strain. He is both agent and instrument. He chooses, yet he also conforms. He bears the crown in public, yet in ritual he bears the pattern set before him. This duality is not a contradiction in the Egyptian view. It is balance. The same man who leads the army must be able to move slowly to match his breath to a melody written into the walls. The same hand that holds a scepter must be capable of gentleness measured in the time it takes incense to rise and thin. Because each rite is anchored to stories of gods, it is never entirely about the people present. The chamber holds more than their bodies. It holds the expectation that creation can be reenacted in miniature, not to produce a child. Every time not to harvest pleasure as its own end, but to renew the line that runs from temple to field, from altar to floodplain. When the rite concludes, what lingers is not exhaustion or boast, but a sense that something has been set right, and may with careful repetition remain so. There is a different kind of quiet afterward. Servants draw water. Linen is folded not hurriedly, not with flourish. The priest's last syllable fades, and with it the heightened attention of the room. The king steps back into the wider life of the palace where decisions await and messages accumulate, yet for a time a residue of stillness clings to him. A reminder that earlier he was not simply a man in a chamber, but a figure in a pattern, older than the stone beneath his feet. Beyond palace walls, this logic touches the city in subtle ways. A festival's timing, a harvest prayer, the way a procession turns at a gate, each is understood as a thread in the same weaving. People know little of the forms inside the palace, but they know enough to trust that the ruler's private rites and the river's public rise are parts of one order. The Nile will swell, wheat will bend, the lamp in a sanctuary will be lit at the moment the sky darkens to indigo. It is not necessary to see the hinge to feel the door turn. When night deepens, the stones cool again. The fragrance of myrrh and acacia thins into the corridors. The women return to their appointed rooms, the priests to their records and careful hands, attendants to the work that will make tomorrow's rites as seamless as today's. There is no applause, no witness beyond those required, no story told besides the one already etched in relief. The kingdom rests not because the day is over, but because its most fragile work binding the human to the divine without a tear has been done once more. In this way, what might elsewhere be private becomes here a means of keeping the world aligned. The pharaoh's body serves as instrument, the chamber serves as stage, the rite serves as bridge. Love as a word is not necessary. Desire as a heat is tempered into shape. What remains is steadiness, the measured pace of a chant, the slow arc of a hand, the certainty that order can be renewed by flesh that consents to be guided by myth. And when sleep finally reaches the palace and the river in equal measure, the pattern does not end. It waits as the carvings wait, as the stars wait above the black line of the horizon. By morning, tasks will resume in their ordinary forms. Yet beneath those tasks lies the same quiet knowledge that has guided generations, that in Egypt the path to balance runs through the body, and that the most intimate acts gently performed and carefully kept can hold a nation steady. When the sun climbed each morning above the horizon of Egypt, its light fell not just on fields and villages, but on a throne whose legitimacy rested upon a fragile threadblood. In the silence of temple courts where hieroglyphs spoke in lines of permanence, one idea was carved again and again, that the pharaoh's family was not merely human but divine. To preserve that divine current, unions had to be drawn inward. Brother to sister, sister to brother. The circle had to close upon itself lest the sacred fire disperse into unworthy hands. To a modern mind, such unions may feel unsettling, but in the age of pyramids and golden tombs, they were considered essential. The gods themselves had given the model. Isis and Osiris, sibling and spouse, bound themselves to one another. And from that joining came Horus the falcon god, avenger and heir. If the gods had sanctified the path, how could a king himself seen as Horus incarnate do otherwise? What we call incest was to them imitation of eternity, a mirror raised to the heavens. The royal palace was the stage where this doctrine played itself out. Within its colonnaded halls, sisters were groomed not simply as daughters of a dynasty, but as future queens. Their education was less about letters or numbers, more about posture, silence, and presence. They were prepared to stand beside their brothers not as companions of affection, but as seals of legitimacy. The closer the blood, the stronger the claim. To marry outside was to dilute the river of divinity. To marry within was to keep it coursing undisturbed. When marriage rites were performed between brother and sister, the ceremony was laden with echoes of myth. Priests recited lines invoking Isis's devotion to Osiris, and the couple was framed not as two mortals making a bond, but as gods reenacting creation. The people watching processions from a distance did not whisper of impropriety. They whispered of protection, for every gesture was thought to shield the land from chaos. The embrace of siblings was not a breach of morality, it was a wall against disorder. The pharaoh himself was caught in this weave of expectation. To take his sister as wife was not a matter of choice, but of survival, his own and Egypt's. Without such a union, courtiers might whisper that his bloodline was flawed, that his crown was lighter, that the gods had not fully poured their essence into his veins. Marriage to a sister answered all such doubts with a single gesture. It said the river still ran straight from divine source to earthly throne. The sister queen once crowned embodied the highest form of legitimacy. She was not merely wife, she was vessel of continuity. Her children carried the double weight of descent, from father as king, from mother as sister. The line folded back upon itself, presenting to the world an image of purity that brooked no challenge. To the eyes of commoners, such unions proved that the palace was less a household, and more a temple, less a family, and more a sanctuary of gods reborn in flesh. Yet behind the grandeur, silence thickened. These marriages often were not chosen with affection. Brothers and sisters who had played together as children found themselves bound in adulthood by decree. The weight of ritual pressed on them, and what was framed as divine imitation could in private feel like duty, with little room for warmth. Still, the expectation endured. Their union was necessary, their children indispensable, their very closeness a matter of statecraft rather than longing. The walls of tombs confirm this with their images. Reliefs show pharaoh and sister-wife side by side, hands joined, eyes forward. No intimacy, only symmetry. Their bodies mirror each other's stance, as if to proclaim to eternity that they are two halves of the same divine source. Inscriptions describe them as beloved of the gods, chosen eternal. The language is unyielding, its rhythm steady like the Nile's. What mattered was not tenderness, but continuity. Such marriages were common, and they became expected. Courtiers who recorded the king's deeds did not treat them as scandal, but as tradition. Scrolls spoke of divine bloodlines, of holy unions, of legitimacy secured. The repetition across generations hardened the custom into necessity. By the time of the New Kingdom, no one within the palace questioned the arrangement. The joining of siblings was as natural as the annual flooding of the river, as inevitable as the turning of the sun across the sky. Still, there were costs. Tutankhamun's story stands as a quiet warning. Born of such a union, his body bore the weight of genetic strain. His bones were frail, his step unsteady. His brief reign was marked not by strength, but by fragility. Yet even in his case, the custom did not waver. His burial mask gleamed with gold, his memory sanctified his deformities, attributed not to bloodline practice, but to divine mystery. Egypt chose to preserve the ritual rather than confront the consequence. And so the pattern endured. To the people of the two lands, the pharaoh's union with his sister was less a marriage than a covenant with the gods. It told farmers that their toil was blessed. It told soldiers that their battles were just. It told scribes that their words recorded more than earthly decrees. It was a story retold in flesh every generation, a new recitation of the myth that had never truly ended. At night, when the palace quieted, the sister queen walked the same stone corridors as her husband-brother, her sandals whispering across polished floors. She knew her role was less about herself than about what she symbolized. To be wife to her brother was to be a guardian of Egypt's breath, to ensure that the line between gods and mortals never snapped. Whatever her personal thoughts, they dissolved beneath the weight of ritual. The crown she bore was not hers alone, but Egypt's. Thus, sibling marriage in ancient Egypt was not scandal, but sanctuary. It was the weaving of myth into marrow, the shaping of blood into bond. The pharaoh and his sister did not simply lie side by side. They lay as Isis and Osiris reborn, as a promise, carved into the very order of the cosmos. And as long as that promise was kept, the Nile would rise, the fields would green, and the people would believe that the gods still walked among them. In the hushed corridors of Egyptian palaces, where walls were painted with gold and silence stretched like linen, the sister queen occupied a role unlike any other. She was not chosen for her charm, nor courted for her wit. Her destiny had been marked long before she reached womanhood. From the day of her birth, her life turned not on affection, but on the expectation that she would stand beside her brother, a wife by decree and a queen by blood. The Egyptians believed that the throne was not simply a seat of power, it was a sacred vessel filled with the breath of gods. For that vessel to remain pure, the woman who shared it had to mirror the same divine stream of lineage. To marry a sister was not indulgence, but duty. To crown her was to prove the dynasty unbroken. She was the seal, the living guarantee that the pharaoh's blood was untainted by the common world. Her training began quietly, often in childhood. While other children played, she sat at her mother's side watching the rituals of the palace. She learned when to bow her head, when to lift her eyes, and when to keep them lowered. Lessons in music, dance, and sacred hymns filled her days. But beneath these refinements lay a deeper instruction to hold herself as an emblem, never simply as a girl. By the time her brother wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, she had already been prepared to stand beside him, not as companion, but as counterpart. The crown she wore told its own story. Fashioned with cobra and vulture emblems, it was not hers in the personal sense. It was an extension of his crown, a reflection of his rule. When she appeared in procession clothed in linen pleated as finely as papyrus leaves, the people did not see a sister. They saw the gods renewing their promise to walk among mortals. She was the image of Isis who had once stood beside Osiris, mothering the future while guarding the present. Inside the palace, her duties were manifold. She oversaw the women's quarters, instructed servants, and maintained the rhythm of offerings within her private shrines. At festivals, she joined her husband-brother in processions, her hands lifted in ritual gestures, as incense curled around her. Her presence was not ornamental, it was vital. Without her, the pharaoh's divinity appeared incomplete. With her, the picture of cosmic order was whole, for her marriage was not a moment of romance, but of confirmation. Priests recited words that had been spoken countless times before binding her body to her brother's, not in affection, but in symbolism. Together they enacted the eternal story Isis and Osiris, reborn love and duty entwined. To the court, it was not passion, but prophecy that mattered. The sister queen was the living assurance that Egypt would endure another generation. Yet the silence of such duty carried weight. Behind carved doors and draped curtains, the sister queen often bore the burden of expectation without respite. Each pregnancy was not only personal, but political. To conceive was to prove divine favor, to miscarry was to invite whispers of divine displeasure. Her womb was a field where Egypt's future was sown, and every outcome was measured not in sorrow or joy, but in omens. When she did bring forth a child, the infant was not truly hers. From the first cry, the baby was wrapped in the trappings of eternity. Priests chanted over its cradle, scribes noted its features, and courtiers read signs in its gestures. Whether strong or weak, the child was hailed as the embodiment of divine continuity. To the mother, it may have been a fragile newborn, but to Egypt, it was the future pharaoh or queen, destined to keep the cosmic order intact. Artists carved her likeness on temple walls, always serene, always poised, standing slightly behind the king. Her profile was perfected, her limbs elongated in the ideal style, her body touched by eternity. In these reliefs, no trace of burden or fatigue appeared. She was eternal balance harmony, embodied the stillness that steadied the throne. Her individuality dissolved into the symbol she was asked to bear, just as her marriage dissolved into ritual necessity. In moments of ritual, she was both participant and vessel. At festivals of fertility, she carried sacred objects symbolizing rebirth. At coronations, she stood beside her brother to affirm his legitimacy. When offerings were made to the gods, her gestures echoed his perfect symmetry of male and female king and queen, Osiris and Isis. Without her presence, the ritual was incomplete, as though one half of creation had gone missing. But outside these ceremonies, her role remained bound in silence. She was watched, guarded, and revered, but rarely heard. Her voice mattered most when it echoed divine order, not personal thought. Yet even in this confinement, the sister queen held a power of her own. Her very existence, her very proximity to the pharaoh, gave her influence that no foreign wife could claim. In her presence, advisors hesitated, priests lowered their gaze. She was the embodiment of the bloodline, and that authority, though unspoken, was undeniable. The system was not without its cracks. At times, younger sisters vied for prominence, their pregnancies shifting the balance of influence within the palace. Mothers and queens clashed quietly, each pressing for her own child's claim to divinity. Yet the overall pattern endured. The sister queen remained central, unshaken in her symbolic role. She was less a woman than a concept, less a consort than a cornerstone. In death, her role followed her into eternity. Tombs of sister queens reveal inscriptions praising not just their beauty, but their purity of blood. Coffins were painted with stars and divine figures, but also with echoes of their earthly duty. In some, their children are shown at their side, tiny figures crowned and robed, as if to remind the gods that the cycle had been preserved. The silence of their lives carried into the stillness of their graves, but the message remained the same. They had served as vessels of continuity, guardians of divine order. As centuries passed and dynasties rose and fell, the figure of the sister queen became a thread woven through Egypt's long tapestry of belief. She was not remembered for speeches or conquests, but for something quieter, for embodying the balance that held the cosmos together. Her marriage was not her own, her children not fully hers, her voice rarely free. Yet through her, Egypt told itself that the blood of God still pulsed within the palace walls. To imagine her now is to picture a figure walking slowly across polished stone floors, her linen dress whispering against her ankles, her crown gleaming softly in the light of oil lamps. Her eyes are lowered, not from weakness, but from the weight of centuries of expectation. She is both woman and myth consort, and seal silent and central. She is the sister queen, the ideal consort, the human face of divine continuity. From the moment a royal child opened his eyes to the golden light of Egypt, his path was already written. Unlike the children of farmers who chased geese in fields, or the children of craftsmen who learned their father's trade, the sons and daughters of the pharaoh lived under the shadow of a single expectation to continue the divine bloodline. Every gesture, every lesson, every step they took was shaped by this unyielding purpose. The firstborn male in particular carried the heaviest weight. His very birth was celebrated not simply as the arrival of a child, but as the renewal of cosmic balance. Priests marked the day with chants, and scribes recorded omens in the sky. He was destined to marry not a distant princess from another land, but one of his own sisters. From infancy, the threads of duty began to weave around him, binding him to a future he could not escape. The preparation started early. His daily lessons were shared with his sisters not by coincidence, but by design. They sat together in small chambers lit by oil lamps, learning sacred hymns, practicing the art of hieroglyphs, and reciting stories of gods who were both siblings and spouses. The shared meals, the shared tutors, the shared hours of silence were all meant to plant the seed of inevitability. By the time he reached maturity, the bond with his sister was less a matter of affection than of training carefully tended by servants and overseen by priests. Even their private moments were watched. Attendants hovered discreetly, noting gestures and recording silences. If a brother's glance lingered a little longer on his sister, it was taken as a sign of destiny fulfilled. If a sister smiled at her brother's joke, priests blessed the moment as divine foreshadowing. Nothing was left to chance. Even tenderness was framed as duty. As adolescence approached, the arrangements grew more explicit. Servants were instructed to house the siblings in adjacent quarters, ensuring proximity without escape. Meals were arranged so they sat beside each other sharing dishes, drinking from cups placed deliberately close. Their schedules aligned, their tutors instructed them side by side, and their steps echoed together in palace courtyards. The very architecture of the palace bent toward this goal, as though the walls themselves pressed them inward, keeping the circle of blood unbroken. The first union was never left to spontaneity. It was scheduled like a festival, its timing chosen by priests who studied the stars and consulted omens. Offerings were prepared in advance, bowls of fruit jars of honey incense to please the gods. Chants were rehearsed, rooms purified, and the air thick with expectation. For the siblings, the moment was less a private threshold than a stage upon which Egypt's fate was believed to depend. The sister was told this was her destiny, her sacred burden. She had been raised not to question, but to accept. The brother, now heir apparent, was reminded that without this union, his claim to the throne could falter. Together they enacted a ritual that mirrored myth. Their joining was framed not as choice but as echo, an echo of Isis and Osiris, of divine siblings, whose love had shaped creation. In this way, the preparation of heirs was not merely physical, but psychological. Every reminder, every lesson, every ritual whispered the same truth: you belong not to yourself, but to the gods. The children absorbed this message until it became second nature. To defy it was unthinkable. To accept it was survival. The palace staff carried their share of this burden. Servants were charged with subtle tasks, recording dreams, monitoring behavior, reporting to priests. If a young prince dreamed of fields or rivers, it was noted as ordinary. But if he dreamed of his sister, it was hailed as divine sanction. If a princess hesitated, advisors soothed her with reminders of her role, her honor, her place in the great chain of blood. Every sigh, every silence was folded into the ritual preparation. In contrast to modern monarchies, where marriages were often arranged across kingdoms to secure alliances, Egypt looked inward. Foreign queens carried the risk of betrayal. Common wives diluted the divine. Only a sister could preserve the illusion of unbroken divinity. Thus the heirs of Egypt grew up not looking outward for companionship, but inward toward one another, their futures already bound before they reached maturity. The pressure was relentless. For the brother, the firstborn son, the demand was clear: produce children with his sister, heirs who would carry the double blessing of royal blood. For the sister, the burden was heavier still. To fail in pregnancy was not merely a personal sorrow, it was seen as a fracture in the divine order. Her worth rose or fell with her womb, and her standing within the palace shifted with each birth or loss. Sometimes multiple sisters were paired with one brother, not out of affection but calculation. If one failed to conceive, another might succeed. Their quarters were placed side by side, their cycles tracked, their diets monitored. They were vessels of destiny, their bodies observed as closely as the stars. For them, preparation meant surrender, the surrender of self, of choice, of any possibility beyond the role assigned at birth. And yet within this rigid system, moments of humanity lingered. A brother's smile at his sister, a whispered word of comfort, a shared memory of childhood games. These quiet acts softened the edges of ritual. But even such moments were quickly swallowed by duty. The union of siblings was never theirs alone. It belonged to Egypt, to the gods, to the endless story carved in stone. In tombs, the heirs are depicted in serene perfection, their small forms seated beside their parents, tiny crowns upon their heads. They are praised not for their innocence, but for their symbolism. Their posture, their gaze, even their breath was recorded as evidence of divine continuation. To live as a royal child was to live already as a symbol, a fragment of myth walking among the living. Thus, the preparation of royal heirs was not a matter of choice, but of design. From the moment of birth, they were folded into a system that demanded not affection, but alignment. Their childhood was not theirs, their unions not theirs, their very futures scripted by priests and advisors. They grew up in marble halls that echoed with silence beneath ceilings painted with stars, believing that their lives were less their own than vessels for the gods. In this way, the heirs of Egypt were raised to be not merely children of kings, but continuations of myth. Their preparation was thorough, relentless, and absolute. And when the time came, they stepped into their roles without hesitation, not because they desired it, but because they had been shaped to see no other path. In the long history of Egypt, where dynasties rose and fell beneath the steady gaze of the Nile, there was one practice that endured across centuries with remarkable resilience: the deliberate union of siblings within the royal house. To those outside the palace walls, it may appear strange, even unsettling. But within the sacred architecture of Egyptian belief, it was not scandal, it was normalcy. The foundation of this tradition lay in myth. The gods themselves, whose stories were carved in temple walls and whispered in hymns, had shown the path. Isis and Osiris were brother and sister, yet their union was celebrated as divine. From their love came Horus, the falcon god, who avenged his father and restored cosmic order. The pharaoh believed to be the living Horus had to mirror this sacred lineage. To do otherwise was to break the chain between heaven and earth. This belief wove itself deeply into the daily life of the royal court. Marriages between siblings, half-siblings, and even uncles and nieces were not whispered about in shame, they were proclaimed as blessings. The closer the blood, the purer the line. To step outside that circle was to risk dilution of divine essence. And so within palaces, shaded by columns and gardens, perfumed with lotus, brothers and sisters were bound together, not by choice, but by expectation. What is striking is how normalized it became. Reliefs on temple walls depict these unions without hesitation. Brother and sister sit side by side, hands, joined crowns gleaming. The artists do not hide the bond, they display it proudly as though to say, "Here's the sacred union of the gods, reborn in our rulers." Inscriptions praise not their romance, but their purity. The language is steady, unwavering, like the Nile itself. He who joins with his sister joins with the gods. There were no warnings, no taboos. What we consider forbidden, the Egyptians considered sacred. The absence of shame created an atmosphere where such unions were seen as natural extensions of divine order. Children raised within the palace grew up with this understanding as the air they breathed. To them, the idea of marrying a sibling was not rebellion, but destiny. For the people beyond the palace, this tradition was a sign of protection. They saw their king not as a man, but as a god in flesh. If he married his sister, it was proof that his blood remained unbroken, untouched by outsiders, preserved in its divine clarity. The farmers working the fields, the traders along the Nile, they accepted this as part of the order that kept the sun rising and the river flowing. The king's private union was not their concern. What mattered was the assurance it gave them that Egypt was safe, its balance maintained. Inside the palace, the practice shaped the lives of women most of all. A princess was never free to dream of distant suitors or foreign alliances. Her fate was already decided. She would stand beside her brother, become queen, and bear the children who carried the double blessing of their shared blood. Her education reinforced this destiny, teaching her to embody Isis, to mirror divinity, to walk not as herself, but as the vessel of eternal order. The pharaoh, too, bore the weight. To him, marrying a sister was not indulgence, but confirmation. Without her, whispers could arise that his claim to the throne was weak. With her, the silence of certainty prevailed. His marriage was less about desire than about legitimacy, and in that silence, tradition tightened its hold. Of course, the consequences of repeated inbreeding grew visible over time. Children born with deformities, with frail limbs, with shortened lives, all became part of the palace reality. Yet these outcomes were never interpreted as failures of the tradition. Instead, priests read them as mysteries of the gods. If a child died young, it was said the gods had needed his soul elsewhere. If a child lived with deformity, it was believed his body had been shaped for a hidden purpose. The tradition itself was never blamed. Faith proved stronger than evidence. Tutankhamun's life remains the most poignant example. Born of such a union, his bones bore the fragile marks of genetic strain. His step was unsteady, his reign brief. Yet even his suffering could not sway the tradition. His golden mask gleamed with perfection, and his burial spoke not of weakness, but of divine eternity. His life may have revealed the cost, but his death reaffirmed the ritual. The cycle continued undisturbed. For the queens who shared this fate, the burden was both immense and invisible. Their worth rose or fell with each birth, their standing shifting like the Nile's floodwaters. To bear a healthy child was to be blessed. To miscarry was to be tested. To remain barren was to be marked by divine disfavor. The hierarchy among sisters changed constantly, each pregnancy rewriting their place in the palace order. And yet, through it all, the tradition remained. Foreign marriages did occur, but they were rare and fraught with suspicion. A foreign queen was a potential spy, a risk to Egypt's secrets, a dilution of sacred blood. To marry a commoner was unthinkable. The circle had to close inward generation after generation, no matter the cost. Egypt chose purity of blood over flexibility of power, and in doing so bound itself to a system that could not bend, only eventually break. Still within the palace, the practice carried not shame, but prestige. A sister queen was seen as the highest possible consort, a woman who embodied both wife and goddess sister and mother of the future. To marry her was to seal one's rule with eternity itself. To stand beside her was to stand in the shadow of Isis. The prestige outweighed the risk, and so the circle continued. As centuries passed, this normalization became so complete that it left little room for dissent. Even when consequences appeared, the explanation was sought in the stars and omens, in forgotten offenses to the gods, not in the unions themselves. Faith and tradition outweighed doubt. And so Egypt marched forward generation after generation, bearing the weight of a belief system that sanctified what others would condemn. In this way, royal incest in Egypt was not anomaly but institution. It was the silent thread that bound dynasties, the unspoken law carved deeper than any decree. To question it was to question the gods themselves, and so no one did. The system endured even as its cracks widened, even as its costs became clear. For Egypt, belief proved stronger than flesh. And so in the palace halls where torches flickered against stone walls, brothers and sisters continued to join their lives. Not with passion, but with expectation. Not with secrecy, but with solemnity. For them it was not a breach of order, but its fulfillment. A ritual not of rebellion, but of balance. A tradition so normalized that it became invisible even as it shaped the fate of a kingdom. In the stillness of royal chambers where walls glittered with painted stars and incense lingered in the air, the consequences of Egypt's closed circle of blood began to emerge. For centuries, priests and courtiers had insisted that sibling unions preserved divine purity. Yet the bodies of royal children told another story, one written, not in hymns or inscriptions, but in bones, in breaths, in the fragile shapes of life cut short. At first the signs were subtle. A limp in a young prince, a faint tremor in a princess's hand, an infant whose cries were weak and short-lived. These were explained away as mysteries of the gods. If a child faltered, priests said his soul had been called to another realm. If a daughter grew frail, they claimed she was chosen for sacred tasks unseen by mortals. But over time, the pattern grew harder to ignore. The very purity so prized in the royal house was breeding fragility within its walls. Some infants lived only days, wrapped in linen, placed in tiny coffins, and buried with amulets pressed to their hearts. They were mourned not as tragedies, but as sacrifices. Their deaths were described in temple inscriptions as gifts to the gods, proof that the divine order had demanded their souls. In one striking case, a newborn who lived only a few weeks was mummified with unusual care, his tiny body wrapped layer upon layer, his head crowned with a golden amulet. The message was clear: even in deformity or early death, he was still divine. But deformities could not always be hidden. Archaeologists today examining the remains of royal mummies have uncovered clubbed feet, cleft palates, elongated skulls, fused toes, and evidence of scoliosis. Tutankhamun himself carried these marks, a frail young man whose lineage had folded back upon itself one time too many. His bones reveal a body weakened by inherited defects. His early death echoes the price of Egypt's devotion to purity. Yet in his own time, no one spoke of genetics. The cause was never the union of siblings, but the will of gods, the alignment of stars, or forgotten offenses buried in memory. The pharaohs were not blind. They saw their children suffer. They buried their infants, comforted their sickly heirs, and watched promising lives fade. Yet even in the face of such pain, the tradition endured. Why? Because to abandon it was to abandon the myth of divinity. To admit that blood could weaken was to admit that the gods themselves could falter. And so faith demanded silence, and silence became the palace's answer. For the queens, the burden was crushing. Their bodies bore the weight of expectation. A sister who miscarried was considered touched by divine trial. A sister whose children died was judged as lacking divine favor. Some were sent away from the palace. Others remained living in the shadows as younger siblings replaced them in the pharaoh's bed. Their fates shifted not with affection, but with pregnancy each month, rewriting their place in the hierarchy of wives. The pharaohs themselves, desperate for heirs, sometimes took multiple sisters as wives. Not from passion, but from calculation. If one womb failed, another might succeed. Their quarters were set side by side, their cycles tracked, their diets adjusted by priests. Each was a vessel waiting to carry the fragile promise of continuation. The palace became a place where life and death walked close together, where a child's first breath was already shadowed by doubt. Despite the risks, each child was honored. Even the most deformed infants were treated with reverence and burial. Their small tombs were painted with stars, their coffins inscribed with hymns, their names preserved in prayers. Egypt could not see them as victims of inbreeding. They were seen instead as mysterious works of the divine shaped in forms beyond human comprehension. The explanation was always sacred, never science. Over time, the genetic toll deepened. Successive generations carried forward the invisible burden of narrowed bloodlines. Weak limbs, shortened lives, fragile heirs all became part of the hidden truth of the palace. Yet the tradition persisted. Why? Because it was anchored not in evidence but in belief. Belief that purity of blood was more important than strength of body. Belief that the gods demanded closeness even when closeness carried a hidden cost. The people beyond the palace rarely saw this truth. They saw only the processions, the golden masks, the crowns glittering in sunlight. They did not witness the frail step of a child behind closed doors or the quiet sobs of a queen who had lost another infant. The myth remained intact because the palace held its silence and the priests covered every weakness with ritual. What was broken in flesh was mended in words. What was frail in life was transformed into eternity through burial. Even so, whispers lingered. Courtiers noticed the king's limp, the prince's cough, the queen's endless mourning. Servants carried stories between chambers of infants, who never grew, of heirs who stumbled at their lessons of funerals conducted in haste. But none dared speak openly. To do so would be to question the divine system, and to question it was to risk chaos. Silence became a form of survival for the palace and for its people. In this way, the genetic consequences of incestuous unions became part of Egypt's hidden history. They were never carved on temple walls, never sung in hymns, never taught in schools. They lived only in the fragile bodies of children, in the shortened lives of kings, and the grief of queens. And yet, for all its cost, the tradition continued. Because belief in divine purity was stronger than evidence, stronger even than the cries of infants fading in the night. It is haunting to imagine the quiet halls of the palace where small coffins were carried out at dawn, wrapped in linen and silence. To the priests, these were not failures but mysteries. To the parents, they were sorrows unspoken. And to Egypt, they were proof that the gods still ruled even if their will was difficult to understand. Thus, the closed circle of blood carried its weight through generations. It preserved the illusion of divine continuity, but at a price etched into bone and flesh. The crowns remained golden, the rituals remained intact, but beneath the surface fragility spread like cracks in stone. The story of Egypt's royal bloodlines is not only one of power and grandeur, it is also one of silence, of suffering hidden behind ritual, of a belief system so strong that it could transform weakness into sanctity and sorrow into faith. In the shadowed heart of Egypt's palaces, where marble floors gleamed under lamplight and the air carried the scent of myrrh, the frailty of royal children was not hidden, it was reinterpreted. What the body revealed in weakness, the priest transformed into mystery. Deformities, illnesses, and untimely deaths were not treated as consequences of narrow bloodlines, but as messages from the gods. In this way, faith wrapped itself around suffering, cloaking it in reverence. A child born with clubbed feet was not whispered about in shame. Instead, his twisted limbs were seen as signs that the divine had shaped him for a special role. A girl whose skull grew elongated was not dismissed as broken. She was believed to carry a mind shaped for otherworldly insight. Even infants who died within days were treated as chosen vessels. Their souls, it was said, had been summoned back to the gods, their brief presence merely a reminder of divine power. This interpretation turned grief into ritual. When a stillborn child was wrapped in linen and laid in a small coffin, chants accompanied the burial as if the child had been a king. Amulets were placed against its chest, golden trinkets pressed into its tiny hands. Death was not seen as failure but as transition. Parents were told not to weep in despair but to honor the will of the gods. The fragility of their children was folded into Egypt's great story of cosmic order. Priests held immense power in this reinterpretation. When a royal child was born with deformities, they declared it not a curse but a test. If the child lived, it was proof of divine favor. If the child died, it was proof of divine need elsewhere. Either way, the tradition of sibling unions remained untouched. The cycle of blood purity endured, safeguarded by faith. The priest who oversaw both births and funerals ensured that no weakness could undermine the myth of sacred lineage. For mothers, the burden was profound. A queen who lost an infant was told she was being tested. A sister wife who birthed a stillborn was told the gods were measuring her devotion. There was little space for private grief. Every loss became a symbol, every deformity a lesson. The women endured silent under the gaze of priests, carrying sorrow that could not be spoken, only ritualized. Children who survived despite deformities were honored in paradoxical ways. They were pampered with jewels and soft linens, praised in inscriptions for their eyes or voices, as though words could cover frailty. Some were depicted in tomb art seated beside their parents, small crowns placed upon heads that bore signs of weakness. In public, they were symbols of divine continuity. In private, their steps were uncertain, their bodies fragile, their futures brief. Yet their survival, however limited, was proclaimed as miracle. Tutankhamun's life stands as a haunting example. His body preserved in his golden coffin reveals frail bones, clubbed feet, and a curved spine. To us, they speak of genetic consequence. To his contemporaries, they were mysteries of divine shaping. His early death at 19 was not seen as the collapse of a dynasty's bloodline, but as the gods' inscrutable choice. The priests wrapped his body in layers of linen, adorned him with treasures, and wrote inscriptions praising his eternity. Weakness in life was transformed into strength in death. This reinterpretation served a purpose. By framing deformities as divine mysteries, Egypt maintained its belief in the sacred bloodline. To admit otherwise would have shattered the foundation of kingship. If sibling marriages produced weakness, then the gods themselves could be questioned. And so the system of belief bent every sign of fragility back into faith. It was not the unions that failed, but omened stars or hidden sins. The bloodline itself remained untouchable. In this way, faith acted as both shield and silence. The people did not question when small coffins left the palace. They did not whisper when princes limped or princesses faltered. They accepted the priest's words, trusted the rituals, and saw divine will where we might see biology. The system endured not because it was free of cost, but because belief was stronger than evidence. Even deformities became part of Egypt's sacred language. Elongated skulls were framed as symbols of wisdom. Clubbed feet were described in hymns as feet that walked the hidden path. Stillbirths were honored with phrases like "he was called too soon," or "her breath was needed in heaven." Language softened reality, weaving human frailty into cosmic order. The people were given a story to believe, and so the cycle continued. For the royal children themselves, life was lived under this strange veil. A prince who could not walk without aid was carried in processions as though his stillness were majesty. A daughter whose body faltered was adorned with jewels to disguise her fragility. They were treated as sacred, yet their humanity aches, pains, fears was hidden beneath layers of expectation. They belonged not to themselves, but to the myth that required them to embody eternity even as their bodies betrayed them. The reinterpretation of deformities as divine mysteries ensured that no weakness could undo the institution of royal incest. The palace remained devoted to its cycle, convinced that blood purity outweighed physical strength. In doing so, Egypt preserved the illusion of divine kingship for centuries, even as the evidence of its fragility lay in small tombs scattered across the desert. It is haunting to imagine the palace corridors filled with silence after another child's death. The servants whispering prayers, the priests chanting hymns, the mother sitting alone, her sorrow reframed as cosmic trial. To us, the deformity might speak of biology. To them, it spoke of the gods. To us, the weakness might reveal consequence. To them, it revealed mystery. And so the cycle endured, carried forward, not by strength, but by faith. Egypt, a land that built monuments to eternity, chose to see fragility not as a flaw, but as part of the sacred order. The bloodline narrowed, the children faltered, but the myth stood tall, unshaken by evidence, sustained by belief. In the still chambers of Egypt's palaces, where walls were painted with stars and floors glistened with polished stone, women of the royal household bore a weight few could carry. They were not only daughters, sisters, and wives, they were vessels of continuity, guardians of the sacred bloodline and bearers of expectations that stretched beyond themselves. Their bodies were temples, and their wombs were seen as fields upon which Egypt's future depended. From the moment of birth, a royal girl's fate was written. While common children might play in dusty courtyards or learn trades at their parents' side, a princess was raised under watchful eyes. She was taught not to think of her own desires, but to prepare for her role beside a brother. Lessons in music and sacred hymns filled her days, but beneath them lay a deeper education: how to embody Isis, how to stand silently as a symbol of divinity, how to surrender her life to the god's design. As she grew, her destiny closed in like the walls of a corridor. She was reminded constantly that she would marry her brother or another close relative, not from love, but from duty. Tutors whispered that to bear his children was not merely personal, but sacred. Her role was not to choose, but to continue to preserve the divine current flowing through her family's veins. Her childhood ended before it had truly begun, replaced by preparation for a destiny she could not escape. When the time of union arrived, the burden deepened. A queen's worth rose or fell with her pregnancies. To conceive was to prove divine favor. To miscarry was to invite whispers of disfavor. A stillborn child was seen not as tragedy, but as a test from the gods. The palace hierarchy shifted constantly with these outcomes. One sister might rise in prominence with a successful birth, while another was pushed aside after repeated loss. Affection did not determine her place, fertility did. The pharaoh himself often had little choice in these matters. His mother and advisors arranged his marriages, pairing him with sisters deemed most promising. If one sister failed, another was brought forward. Some pharaohs married multiple sisters at once, not from desire but from calculation. Their cycles were tracked, their diets monitored, their dreams recorded as omens. The women's lives became a series of measurements, their humanity reduced to signs of divine approval or disapproval. The psychological toll was immense, yet the palace left no room for grief. A queen who mourned too openly risked being seen as unfit. Her sorrow reinterpreted as weakness. She was expected to maintain composure to continue rituals to appear serene in public, even as her private world trembled. Her body might ache, her heart might break, but her face had to remain calm, framed by jewels and painted eyes. Some queens were sent away after repeated failures replaced by younger sisters. Others remained within the palace walls living in silence as their rivals rose in influence. They watched from the shadows as the hierarchy shifted with each new pregnancy. Their worth was tied not to who they were, but to what they could produce. In this way, the burden of royal women was as much about invisibility as it was about expectation. Still, their influence could be profound. The queen mother, once chosen as sister wife herself, often held enormous power. She oversaw the marriages of her sons, ensured the cycle continued, and whispered into the ears of advisors. Having endured the burden herself, she knew how to maintain the system. Her authority extended beyond the palace walls, shaping alliances, rituals, and even the succession of thrones. Yet her power came not from freedom, but from conformity. By embodying the system fully, she became its strongest guardian. For the younger wives, life was more precarious. Their success depended entirely on the health of their children. A miscarriage could erase years of influence. A stillbirth could shift their place overnight. A healthy son, however, could raise them from obscurity to prominence. The stakes were absolute, leaving no space for personal longing. Their lives were measured in cycles, their status in swaddled infants. The strain of this system is difficult to overstate. Each pregnancy carried not only the hopes of a family, but the weight of a kingdom. If the heir was frail, the dynasty trembled. If the heir died, the people murmured of omens. The queen bore responsibility for the stability of Egypt itself. Failure was not seen as fate, but as flaw, and the blame fell most heavily on her. And yet within this rigid framework, some women found subtle ways to assert themselves. Through ritual, through patronage of temples, through influence over their sons, they shaped Egypt's destiny quietly, even while carrying the immense burden placed upon them. Their names endure not always in bold inscriptions, but in the margins of history, woven into the lives of the heirs they bore and the dynasties they sustained. In death, their burden was remembered differently. Tomb inscriptions praised them as beloved of the gods, mothers of kings, vessels of divine order. Their sarcophagi depicted them serene, crowned, eternal. The weight they carried in life was transformed into symbols of harmony in death. No mention was made of sorrow or struggle, only of duty fulfilled. Their pain dissolved into myth, their silence immortalized as strength. It is haunting to imagine them walking the palace corridors, their linen dresses whispering against the stone, their faces painted to perfection, their eyes lowered in ritual calm. Behind the stillness, their hearts must have carried both hope and fear, joy and grief. But the system allowed no cracks. Their bodies belonged to Egypt, their children to the gods, their lives to the continuity of the bloodline. Thus, the burden of royal women was not only physical but spiritual. They bore children, but they also bore the weight of belief itself. Through them, Egypt maintained the illusion of divine eternity. Through their silence, the system endured. Through their suffering, the throne remained unshaken. They were at once queens and sacrifices, honored in name, yet bound in body, remembered not for themselves but for the lineage they preserved. In the end, the burden of Egypt's royal women was both invisible and immense. Their lives were woven into the fabric of belief so tightly that their voices could not be heard. And yet without them, the myth of divine kingship could not have survived. They were the unseen pillars of Egypt's eternity, bearing silently the weight of a kingdom that demanded more from them than any human should have been asked to give. In the intricate web of Egypt's royal court, where silence was often more powerful than speech, one figure stood at the center of quiet authority, the Queen Mother. She was the woman who had once borne the weight of expectation herself, who had lived as a sister wife and who now carried a different kind of burden. Having given birth to the king, she held a place no other woman could claim. Her presence was not only maternal, it was political, spiritual, and symbolic. From the moment her son took the throne, the Queen Mother's influence extended like invisible threads through the palace. She had endured the system, submitted to its demands, and now used that knowledge to shape the future. In council meetings, her voice was rarely recorded, but her hand was felt. Advisors deferred to her, priests sought her blessing, and even the pharaoh himself often looked to her for confirmation. She was both memory and guide, a living reminder of the cycle that had to continue. Her authority was rooted in experience. Having once been chosen as her brother's consort, she knew the weight of expectation placed upon royal women. She knew the shifting hierarchies, the sting of loss, the triumph of a successful birth. When her son faced the same cycle, she ensured the tradition did not falter. It was often the Queen Mother who arranged his marriage, selecting sisters to stand beside him, advising priests on omens and whispering reassurance or command into her son's ear. In this way, she preserved the system from within. To deviate was dangerous. A king who sought a foreign bride risked scandal. A prince who resisted his sisters risked doubt in his legitimacy. The Queen Mother, understanding the fragility of perception, made sure no such cracks appeared. She became the guardian of continuity, the silent enforcer of tradition. Her influence extended into the private chambers as well. She monitored the hierarchy among her son's wives, ensuring that rivalry did not spiral into open conflict. She oversaw the upbringing of grandchildren, guiding their education in ritual and expectation. She was present at births, advising midwives and interpreting omens. Her hand rested on the cradle of heirs, her eyes watching for signs of strength or weakness. In this way, she became both protector and judge, shaping dynasties before they could shape themselves. Temples recorded her role in subtle ways. In inscriptions, she was sometimes depicted standing just behind her son, smaller in scale but central in placement. Her titles reflected her authority: Mother of the God, she who bore the king. Mistress of the two lands. These names carried more than reverence, they carried weight. They reminded all who read them that the pharaoh's legitimacy flowed not only from his father, but from the woman who had brought him into the world. The Queen Mother's chambers were often filled with both reverence and tension. Other wives of the king might resent her influence, yet they could not challenge her openly. Her word carried the weight of divine continuity, and her proximity to the pharaoh gave her unmatched power. Even in her silence, she was a presence that could not be ignored. Her role became especially vital in moments of crisis. If the pharaoh died young, it was the Queen Mother who steadied the throne. She might act as regent until her grandson came of age. She might oversee rituals to preserve stability, her authority preventing chaos. In these times, her influence was no longer hidden but open, her guidance ensuring Egypt remained whole. Yet her power was not born of freedom, but of sacrifice. She had once been the silent bride, the burdened mother, the vessel of expectation. By fulfilling that role, she earned a place of authority in her later years. Her influence was real, but it was built on the foundation of conformity. She did not break the system, she reinforced it, ensuring its survival for another generation. The Queen Mother's presence could be felt in the smallest details of court life. If a young queen faltered, it was the Queen Mother who decided her fate. If a priest hesitated, it was the Queen Mother who whispered assurance. If the pharaoh wavered, it was the Queen Mother who steadied his resolve. Her hand was invisible in records, but it shaped decisions that rippled through temples, battlefields, and tombs. Even in death, her role was remembered differently from that of other queens. Her tomb inscriptions often emphasized not her beauty or fertility, but her position as the mother of kings. Her statues depicted her seated beside her son, her hand resting on his shoulder, her presence eternal. She was not remembered as wife or sister, but as the woman who had preserved the divine order through her womb and through her guidance. It is haunting to imagine her walking slowly through palace corridors. Her steps measured, her gaze steady. Younger queens lowered their eyes as she passed. Priests bowed, servants stepped aside. She carried no crown, yet her authority was unmistakable. She was the embodiment of endurance, the one who had borne the burden, and now wielded the power it granted. In many ways, the Queen Mother was the true axis of continuity. Pharaohs came and went, sisters rose and fell, but she remained shaping generations from behind the veil of ritual. Her influence was quiet, but it was steady, like the Nile itself, rarely acknowledged yet essential. Without her, the cycle might have faltered. With her, it endured even as cracks spread through the bloodline she worked so tirelessly to preserve. Thus, the Queen Mother's role was one of paradox. She was powerful, yet her power rested on submission. She was revered, yet her reverence came from sacrifice. She was central, yet her centrality required silence. Her life was both privilege and burden, shaping Egypt's destiny while erasing her own individuality. And when her son stood as pharaoh, the people looked at him and saw a god. But behind him stood the quiet figure of his mother, the unseen hand guiding the throne. Within the labyrinth of Egypt's royal palaces, where torchlight flickered against painted columns and silence carried more weight than speech, the practice of taking multiple sisters as wives unfolded with quiet inevitability. For the pharaoh, this was not a matter of affection or indulgence. It was a calculation, a way to secure heirs, to strengthen legitimacy, and to ensure that divine blood flowed unbroken, even when chance or frailty threatened the line. The reasoning was simple, at least to those who upheld the system. One sister might fail to conceive, another might lose her child in infancy, a third might bear only daughters when sons were demanded. By marrying multiple sisters, the pharaoh multiplied his chances of producing a healthy heir. The practice was not whispered in shame, but proclaimed as prudence, a safeguard against uncertainty. In the women's quarters, this arrangement created a world both intimate and fraught. Sisters who had grown up sharing lessons, meals, and games now shared a husband. Their chambers stood side by side, their lives intertwined by design. Servants tracked their cycles, recording signs of fertility. Diets were adjusted to increase vitality. Honey dates and herbs believed to enhance conception were brought daily to their tables. Midwives and priestesses hovered, measuring each sign as if it were an omen of Egypt's future. The competition among them was silent but fierce. A sister who conceived quickly rose in influence, her status climbing like the floodwaters of the Nile. She was honored in ceremonies, praised in hymns, and given authority over household rituals. Another who miscarried or failed to conceive saw her influence wane. Her smiles grew thinner, her presence dimmer, as younger sisters replaced her in the pharaoh's attention. The hierarchy shifted constantly, as fragile as the infants upon whom it depended. Yet despite rivalry, the bonds of sisterhood endured. They were bound not only to their husband-brother, but to each other, caught in the same cycle of expectation. They prayed together, performed rituals together, and at times wept together in silence when loss struck. Their unity was complex, woven from both competition and shared burden. In this way, they became both rivals and allies, mirrors of each other's fate. The pharaoh himself was less a figure of choice than of obligation. His marriages were arranged by advisors, approved by priests, and often urged by his mother. His role was to comply, to fulfill the system's demand. Even if affection stirred in one direction, duty required that he divide himself among his sisters, ensuring no single womb bore the full weight of expectation. His nights, his meals, his presence were managed with precision, rotated like the turning of seasons. To the people outside the palace, the arrangement was not scandalous. They did not see rivalry or sorrow. They saw only the processions, the queens standing beside their king, adorned with jewels and linen, their faces serene. The presence of multiple queens did not speak of tension, it spoke of abundance. To them, it was proof that Egypt's bloodline was secure, that the divine order remained intact. Within tombs and temples, this reality was recorded in stone. Reliefs depict the pharaoh seated with more than one queen at his side. Their profiles aligned, their crowns identical. Inscriptions describe them not as rivals, but as complements, each carrying a share of divine favor. The images omit rivalry painting, instead a vision of harmony. What mattered was not their personal lives, but the symbolism they carried, that Egypt's continuity was doubly, even triply ensured. Still, the strain of this arrangement pressed heavily on the women. Their bodies bore repeated pregnancies, their lives measured in swaddled infants. Their joy or sorrow was not personal but political. Their wombs weighed against the needs of a kingdom. Some bore many children, yet watched them die young. Others carried deformities in their offspring, yet endured the blame in silence. Each child, each outcome reshaped their standing, lifting one sister while casting another into shadow. The Queen Mother often oversaw this hierarchy. Having once lived as a sister wife herself, she understood the system and managed it with quiet authority. She ensured that no single sister dominated too fully, that rivalries did not explode into chaos, that the cycle of conception and succession remained unbroken. Her influence steadied the fragile balance even as it reinforced the burden upon her daughters. Occasionally, inscriptions hint at the cost. A hymn might speak of the tears of the chosen, or the silence of the sisters. Such phrases suggest grief, unspoken sorrow folded into ritual. But these glimpses remain rare. The system left little space for the voices of women. Their suffering dissolved into duty, their rivalry into ritual, their individuality into the collective symbol of continuity. In rare instances, a pharaoh might favor one sister above the others. Affection, though discouraged, could not always be suppressed, yet even then duty demanded balance. The favored queen might bear titles of prominence, but her sisters remained present, their roles preserved for the sake of legitimacy. No matter what affection stirred privately, the public face remained the same: harmony, symmetry, divine order. In death, the sisters were remembered not as rivals, but as pillars of eternity. Their tombs often lay close together, their inscriptions praising them as beloved of the gods, mothers of kings, guardians of the sacred bloodline. Their individuality faded, their shared burden transformed into shared honor. The rivalry that marked their lives was erased, replaced by the image of unity that Egypt demanded. It is haunting to imagine them walking side by side through palace halls, their linen dresses brushing softly against stone, their crowns gleaming in lamplight. Each carried her own hopes and fears, her own private griefs. Yet together they stood silent and serene, embodying the order that held Egypt together. Their lives were not their own. They belonged to the myth, to the gods, to the continuity of the throne. Thus, the practice of marrying multiple sisters was not indulgence, but necessity. It was a system designed to multiply chances, to secure heirs, to protect the illusion of divine purity. Its cost was borne by women who surrendered their lives to duty, and by children whose fragile bodies carried the consequences. Yet Egypt endured, its kings and queens preserved in stone, their lives remembered not for themselves, but for the role they played in sustaining the eternal cycle. In the gilded chambers of Egypt's palaces, where murals of gods looked down from painted ceilings, the children of sibling marriages entered the world already cloaked in expectation. They were not merely infants wrapped in linen, they were living proof of continuity, embodiments of a divine order, carefully guarded by generations of kings and queens. From their first breath, their existence was more than personal. It was political, spiritual, and eternal. When a queen, often the sister of the pharaoh, gave birth, the event was recorded with ceremony. Priests chanted hymns, incense filled the air, and offerings were laid at temple altars. The newborn was not treated as fragile flesh, but as the manifestation of Horus, the falcon god reborn to guard Egypt. Whether the child was strong or weak, healthy or frail, mattered less than the symbolism of the birth. To the people, it was not simply a child, it was Egypt's promise renewed. Art and inscriptions depicted these children in idealized form. Reliefs showed them standing tall beside their parents, crowned with miniature diadems, their faces serene and flawless. They were rendered not as vulnerable infants, but as perfect symbols, divine heirs in miniature. Even when reality did not match the image, even when the child was sickly, deformed, or short-lived, the art remained unyielding. The message carved into stone was clear: the bloodline remained pure, the gods remained present. The firstborn son held the greatest weight. From his earliest days, he was treated less as a child than as a future king. His education began almost immediately. Tutors instructed him in sacred hymns, priests guided him through rituals, and scribes placed scrolls in his hands before he could fully read. He was watched constantly, his health monitored, his gestures recorded as omens. A simple cough could spark whispers, a stumble could be interpreted as a sign from the gods. His very body was scrutinized for hints of divine strength or weakness. Daughters, too, carried heavy expectations. Though they would never rule in their own right except in rare exceptions, their fate was equally bound by blood. They were groomed from birth to marry their brothers, to repeat the cycle that had created them. Their toys were miniature versions of ritual objects, their lullabies filled with stories of Isis and Osiris. Even their games prepared them for roles they could not escape. By the time they reached womanhood, their future as sister wives was already sealed. The lives of these children were therefore both privileged and precarious. Privileged because they lived in luxury, surrounded by jewel servants and education. Precarious because their health was fragile, their futures uncertain. Many did not survive beyond childhood. Small coffins were carried quietly from the palace, accompanied by chants and incense. Yet even in death, they were treated not as lost children, but as divine beings returning to the gods. Their brief lives were folded into the narrative of eternity, their deaths explained as mysteries of divine will. For those who lived, the burden never lightened. A young prince grew up under the constant gaze of courtiers, priests, and advisors, all eager to mold him into a pharaoh. His every lesson was heavy with symbolism, his every action measured against myth. A young princess grew up knowing she would be given in marriage not to a foreign ally or distant noble, but to her brother, repeating the cycle that had shaped her life. Neither could imagine a life outside this path. Their identities were consumed by the system before they even had the chance to form. In some cases, children of divine unions showed visible signs of the genetic toll. Limping princes, daughters with misshapen features, sons who died before reaching manhood, all bore witness to the cost of purity. Yet even then, the system did not falter. The weaknesses of the body were reinterpreted as sacred mysteries, tests of endurance, or marks of divine uniqueness. No failure was admitted, no flaw acknowledged. The bloodline itself remained beyond question. The psychological weight on these children was immense. They were raised not to see themselves as individuals, but as symbols. Their joys and sorrows, their hopes and fears mattered little compared to the role they were forced to play. A prince who longed for freedom found none. A princess who dreamed of choice was reminded that her destiny was already written. Their humanity dissolved beneath the weight of expectation, their individuality silenced by ritual. And yet moments of tenderness must have existed. A mother cradling her newborn whispering lullabies, even as priests recited hymns. A father watching his son take his first steps, torn between pride and fear. Siblings playing together in palace courtyards, unaware that one day they would be bound as husband and wife. These small human moments flickered beneath the surface, even as the system demanded silence. In death, the children of divine unions were memorialized as eternal. Tombs were filled with treasures, inscriptions praised their purity, and their names were preserved in prayers. Whether they lived decades or mere days, they were remembered, not for their individuality, but for the role they played in sustaining the illusion of divine continuity. Their lives, however brief or burdened, were woven into Egypt's eternal tapestry. Thus, the children of divine unions were both treasures and sacrifices. They embodied the hope of Egypt, yet carried the hidden cost of its traditions. They were born into privilege, yet shackled by duty. Their lives were framed as miracles, yet often ended in fragility. They were at once symbols of eternity and reminders of mortality, their existence proof of both the power and the peril of closed bloodlines. It is haunting to imagine their laughter echoing through palace halls, their small feet pattering on polished stone, their eyes bright with curiosity. To their parents, they were children. To Egypt, they were continuity. To the gods, they were offerings. Their humanity was real, but it was hidden beneath layers of expectation, ritual, and belief. In the end, the children of divine unions were not remembered for themselves, but for what they represented. They were living symbols shaped by myth, bound by duty, sacrificed to a tradition that valued bloodline over life. Through them, Egypt preserved its illusion of divinity, even as their fragile bodies bore the cost. They were at once the kingdom's future and its silent victims, walking proof that faith could endure even when flesh could not. In the marble corridors of Egypt's palaces, where lamps flickered against painted walls and the air carried the faint perfume of lotus, the cost of the royal system remained shrouded in ritual. What was fragile in flesh was concealed beneath ceremony. What was broken in body was rewritten as divine mystery. The true consequences of incestuous unions, deformities, stillbirths, early deaths were never acknowledged as failures of blood. Instead, they were buried beneath chance offerings and silence. When a child was born frail or deformed, priests did not speak of weakness. They proclaimed the birth a sign of divine will, a shaping of the gods. The infant, no matter how fragile, was wrapped in linen, as though destined for eternity. If the child lived, its survival was hailed as a miracle. If it died, its passing was explained as a return to the divine realm. Either way, the tradition itself remained untouchable. The burden was carried by the child, but the weight of explanation was carried by ritual. Funerals became a primary means of concealment. A stillborn infant was buried with golden amulets, miniature coffins, painted with stars and inscriptions praising its purity. Priests chanted hymns framing the loss not as tragedy, but as fulfillment of divine order. Families were instructed to grieve in silence, to accept the god's decision without question. Through ceremony, the pain of loss was transformed into cosmic necessity. Ritual muted sorrow, turning human suffering into sacred narrative. Even in life, ritual disguised reality. A prince who limped was carried in processions, his stillness presented as majesty. A daughter who struggled to walk was shown in art, standing tall beside her parents, flawless and serene. Sculptors smoothed away imperfections, painters elongated limbs into ideal forms. What the body revealed, art erased. Inscriptions praised children as strong, beautiful, beloved of the gods, even when whispers in the palace told a different story. This concealment was not accidental, it was deliberate. The priests' advisors and scribes who sustained the system knew that kingship depended on belief. If the people saw weakness, if they doubted the purity of the bloodline, the illusion of divine kingship might falter. And so, every crack was covered with gold, every frailty veiled by ritual. The truth remained locked. Behind palace walls spoken only in whispers, never carved in stone. For the royal women, ritual became both shield and prison. Their miscarriages were explained away as divine tests. Their stillbirths were framed as offerings demanded by the gods. Their grief was silenced by chants, their sorrow transformed into sacred duty. They bore the consequences in their bodies, but the system refused to name those consequences. Instead, it wrapped them in ritual, making their pain invisible. The pharaohs themselves participated in this concealment. A king who buried frail heirs continued to appear in festivals with serene confidence, his queens at his side, their children portrayed as flawless. His legitimacy rested not on reality, but on ritual performance. Each procession, each offering, each coronation was staged to affirm the myth of unbroken divinity. His personal grief, if he felt it, remained hidden behind the mask of eternity. Over generations, this concealment created a strange duality. On the surface, Egypt appeared stable, its kings divine, its queens radiant, its children embodiments of purity. Beneath, fragility spread like cracks in stone. But because those cracks were never named, the system endured. Belief proved stronger than truth. Ritual did not only hide consequences, it erased them from memory. Archaeology reveals what ritual concealed. The mummies of royal children show deformities that art never recorded: fused bones, curved spines, misshapen skulls. Tutankhamun's body speaks of frailty, hidden beneath golden mask and treasure-laden tomb. The silence of ritual is broken only now, centuries later, as science uncovers what faith once denied. Yet in their own time, the Egyptians never admitted such truths. Ritual remained the language through which every consequence was translated back into divinity. This concealment shaped not only the palace but the people's faith. Farmers who watched the pharaoh's processions never saw deformity. They saw only symbols of eternity carved in perfection. Traders who passed temple walls never read inscriptions of weakness. They read only hymns to purity and strength. The people's belief in divine kingship remained unshaken because ritual allowed no crack to appear. And so the consequences of incestuous unions, though very real, never threatened the system. They were absorbed, disguised, and transformed. Pain became sacrifice, weakness became mystery, death became offering. Ritual turned every loss into continuity, every flaw into harmony. Yet the cost was borne by those within the palace, by mothers who endured repeated losses, their grief silenced, by children who carried frailty in their bodies, yet were forced to stand as symbols, by kings who watched heirs die, yet presented unbroken serenity to their people. Their lives were consumed by the demand to sustain belief even when their own experience told a harsher truth. It is haunting to picture a small coffin carried through palace corridors at dawn, incense curling in the cold air, priests chanting softly. A mother walking behind her face veiled her heart heavy. The coffin lowered into the earth surrounded by amulets and hymns. The ritual complete, the grief silenced. To the gods, it was an offering. To the palace, it was duty. To the system, it was nothing more than proof that the cycle endured. Thus, the consequences of closed bloodlines remained hidden behind ritual. Egypt, a civilization that built monuments to eternity, chose to cover fragility with ceremony, to bury pain beneath hymns, to disguise weakness with art. The system survived not because it was free of cost, but because ritual was strong enough to turn every cost into faith. And so the kingdom endured its truth, concealed its myth, unbroken, its silence eternal. In the shadowed chambers of Egypt's temples, initiation began not with triumph, but with surrender. Young candidates entering the priesthood were stripped first of expectation, then of self. Silence was the rule and submission the path. It was through these conditions that a man crossed the threshold from ordinary life into sacred service. A candidate who resisted the ritual's demands did not face punishment in the way one might expect. No whips, no public shaming. Instead, he was quietly redirected, his name erased from lists, his body reassigned to lesser duties. Some were sent to labor in temple fields, their hands cultivating grain for offerings. Others became minor guards patrolling outer walls or carrying water jars. For those deemed entirely unsuitable, the temple assigned them to menial work, sweeping courtyards, maintaining gardens, or tending sacred animals. Their failure was not acknowledged. It was simply absorbed into silence. For those who did not resist but failed in performance, a different path awaited. Temple healers would step forward administering herbal stimulants, brews of lotus and desert herbs designed to rouse the body. If this failed, the judgment was spiritual, not medical. A man whose body did not respond was declared blocked by the gods, his soul unready to serve. Such men were dismissed not with anger but with quiet pity. Their unresponsive flesh was read as rejection by the divine. For those who passed, the meaning was clear, readiness of the body was divine approval. To falter was to be denied. The ritual carried weight beyond its physical act. A man's body was transformed into a measure of worth, his soul, judged through silence and compliance. The priestess who carried out the ritual did not change her role afterward. She was not elevated, not shamed, not altered in standing. It was part of her service as routine as leading chants or preparing offerings. If she found the duty painful, she was forbidden to speak of it. Her silence was part of the ritual's structure. Both she and the candidate were expected to detach themselves, to treat the act not as personal, but as sacred. Yet beneath this detachment, bureaucracy lingered. Each candidate was scheduled, each act recorded, each result entered into temple lists. The body in this system became a checklist, the soul a requirement. What should have been human remained only as data. Something intimate was transfigured into administration. The act was remembered not in memory but in record. The origins of this ritual were debated even in ancient times. Some traced it to the Middle Kingdom, when temple hierarchies hardened into strict systems of roles and duties. Others suggested it grew out of older fertility rites, slowly absorbed into priestly culture as Egypt's religion expanded. Whatever its beginning by the New Kingdom, it had become institutionalized. Every major temple had a chamber for this purpose. Every class of priest included men who had endured it. There is no record of women refusing to participate as priestesses. Whether this silence was the result of duty pressure or belief remains unclear. But it is certain none were exempt. The act was performed, endured, and absorbed into the rhythms of temple life. Among the initiates, silence was again demanded. They were told that to speak of the ritual would diminish its sanctity. To remember it too vividly meant it had failed. The absence of discussion was as important as the act itself. In this way, the ritual erased its own traces. It existed only in bureaucracy and in the subtle marks it left on those who passed through it. Those marks were not physical. They were behavioral. Men who had undergone the rite often carried themselves differently afterward. Their steps slowed. Their eyes lowered, their hands held close to their bodies. Some looked upon the priestess with reverence, others with fear, but always with distance. Personal ambition seemed to fade. What remained was a vessel prepared for sacred work. This transformation was the ritual's purpose. It was not punishment, but preparation. A man emerged from it stripped of ego, emptied of pride, ready to interpret dreams, to burn incense, to stand within sacred chambers, without carrying the weight of himself. Submission had shaped him into a vessel, and yet crossing this threshold was not the end. Once an initiate had passed through silence and submission, another trial awaited one without priestess, without privacy, a mirror, a blade, and the young man alone. The ritual of self-wounding demanded that he cut himself in silence, an offering of pain, to prove surrender of self. This too was part of initiation, one more act of erasure, one more step toward dissolving personal identity. In these ways, the temple forged its servants. Through silence, submission, and ritual acts, men were reshaped into vessels for the gods. What began as human was steadily dissolved into sacred function. The cost was identity, individuality, voice. The gain was entry into the sacred order of Egypt, where the personal self vanished into ritual. It is easy to imagine the stillness of such chambers, the dim light, the rustle of linen, the weight of incense. Young men entering uncertain and emerging with eyes lowered, transformed. The silence held their stories unspoken, erased by ritual. And yet, that silence was powerful. It was the foundation upon which Egypt's temples built their authority, the hidden ground upon which faith and hierarchy stood. Within the palace walls where columns rose like trees of stone, and every surface glowed with painted myth, the rules of bloodline were as binding as the laws of the gods themselves. For the sons and daughters of the royal household, life was shaped long before they could speak. They were not raised for choice nor for affection, but for duty. And that duty was reproduction, sacred, deliberate, and confined to their own blood. The Egyptians believed the pharaoh was not merely a ruler. He was the living embodiment of the gods, the child of Horus upon the earth, his body carrying divine essence. Because of this, his blood was not ordinary. It was sacred, a vessel of eternity. And as the gods were said to wed their sisters, so, too, were the pharaoh's heirs expected to look within the family for their partners. Marriage between siblings, half-siblings, even aunts and nephews was not whispered of in shame. It was spoken of as honor. A prince uniting with his sister did not violate taboo. Instead, he fulfilled destiny. The closer the blood, the purer the divine line. To produce a child with a sister was considered not transgression, but triumph, a continuation of sacred lineage that kept the throne untouched by the ordinary world. From the moment a prince was born, the expectation began. His name might already be paired in temple lists with that of a sister not yet grown. Their lives intertwined by decree, shared lessons in literacy and ritual, shared meals under watchful eyes, and eventually shared quarters as maturity approached. Servants monitored them constantly, reporting every glance, every word, every gesture of affection to the priests. If affection did not appear naturally, it was summoned through ritual blessings. The union itself was never left to chance. The first night between royal siblings was often staged as part of a larger ritual. Offerings were made, chants filled the air, and priests stood nearby invoking gods of fertility and protection. What to the outside world might have seemed deeply personal was in the Egyptian court transformed into public duty, a performance for the gods, not for desire. In the architecture of power, these marriages were reinforced everywhere. Temple walls carried images of divine siblings, Isis and Osiris, Nut and Geb, forever bound in eternal embrace. Royal couples were painted in the same poses, their closeness framed as reflection of divine order. The very stones whispered the lesson siblings must unite, for to do otherwise was to risk disorder. Compared with the monarchies of later centuries where kings married foreign princesses to build alliances, the Egyptian approach was the opposite. To marry outside the bloodline was to weaken it, to let the divine essence be diluted by ordinary flesh. A foreign queen brought risk. A common bride brought doubt. Only within the circle could the line remain pure. And so, generation after generation, the pattern held. Princes were bound to sisters, nieces, or cousins. Queens were often sisters before they were wives. Even daughters of kings knew from childhood that their role was not to seek beyond, but to remain within their futures, sealed by lineage. This system carried its own weight of prestige. A child born of such a union was not seen as fragile. Instead, the child was elevated as the purest of the pure. Reliefs showed royal children seated beside their parents' crowns, resting upon small heads, inscriptions praising their perfection. They were presented to the court not as infants, but as symbols of eternity, living proof that the divine line endured. Yet behind this exaltation lay a hidden pressure. The weight of duty pressed hardest on the eldest son. From his earliest years, he was paired with sisters, expected to fulfill destiny as soon as his body matured. Love did not matter. Preference did not matter. His life was bound to blood. Failure to produce an heir with a sister risked whispers of divine displeasure, shadows of doubt that could spread through the court. For the sisters, the burden was just as heavy. Their bodies became the vessels of lineage, judged not for beauty or wit, but for fertility. A sister who conceived quickly was honored. A sister who did not was quietly set aside, her role transferred to another sibling. Hierarchies among sisters rose and fell with each pregnancy, each birth. Their value was measured in children and in the survival of those children. Within this system, love and choice were nearly absent. Destiny, reinforced by law and ritual, overshadowed everything. And yet for those raised in the palace, it felt normal. Incest, as understood today with its taboos and prohibitions, did not exist in the same sense. To them, it was duty sacred and unquestioned. It is possible to imagine the stillness of those palace corridors at night, young siblings paired by decree walking side by side, knowing what was expected. Priests waiting at thresholds, servants whispering of omens, queens and advisors ensuring that the cycle continued. The air itself carried the weight of expectation, heavy with incense and silence. Through this system, Egypt preserved its myth of purity. The divine blood remained enclosed, untouched by outsiders. Kings rose proclaiming their perfection. Queens stood radiant beside them. Children were presented as symbols of eternity. All the while, the true cost remained hidden behind ceremony. The bodies of princes and sisters bore the burden. Their lives, their choices, their loves were consumed by the single demand of lineage. It is haunting to reflect on the firmness of this system. To break from it was unthinkable. To marry outside the bloodline was to invite suspicion, whispers of weakness, threats of instability. And so even as the centuries passed, the circle remained closed, as rigid as the stone walls that surrounded the palace. The royal bloodline was not simply family, it was Egypt's bridge to the gods. To protect it, every sacrifice was demanded and every bond of affection bent beneath ritual. What we see now as strange or unsettling, they saw as sacred, necessary, eternal. And so the system endured generation after generation, blood folded upon itself, lineage preserved not through choice but through destiny. In the quiet heart of the royal palace, where shadows stretched across polished floors and the murmur of prayers echoed through painted halls, sibling marriages unfolded not as scandal but as destiny. What to modern eyes appears forbidden was in the world of ancient Egypt, sanctified by myth and reinforced by ritual. For those born into the royal household, the path was not chosen. It was set before their first breath. The guiding principle came from the gods themselves. Isis and Osiris Nut and Geb's siblings bound in sacred embrace served as eternal models for divine unity. If the gods wedded their brothers and sisters, then so too must the rulers who embodied them upon the earth. To stray from this path was not only rebellion against custom, but rebellion against the cosmic order itself. From an early age, royal children were prepared for this destiny. A brother and sister might be seated side by side at lessons, their tablets laid before them on the same table. They ate together their meals, observed by servants who noted signs of closeness. They were often dressed in matching garments, their appearances arranged to symbolize their eventual union. To outsiders, it may have seemed like the simple intimacy of siblings. But within the palace, every shared glance was a step toward the fulfillment of divine duty. By the time adolescence approached, these pairings became formalized. A brother was told that his sister was destined to be his queen. A sister was instructed that her womb carried the weight of eternity. Their first union was not left to chance or affection. It was staged within a ritual chamber, priests invoking blessings while incense curled in the lamplight. The act, though intimate in nature, was absorbed into ritual, its private meaning dissolved into sacred purpose. There were no words of hesitation. Within the palace, incest was not viewed as transgression. There were no warnings, no taboos, no sense of secrecy. Instead, it carried prestige. To marry one's sister was to prove loyalty to the gods. To lie with her was to fulfill destiny. Desire was secondary. Devotion was primary. This normalization seeped into every part of courtly life. Temple walls depicted royal couples in divine embrace, their likenesses mirrored against those of Isis and Osiris. Inscriptions praised their children not as mere heirs, but as incarnations of purity. Even the smallest gestures were layered with symbolism: a prince placing his hand on his sister's shoulder, a queen gazing at her brother husband beneath painted stars. Each image reinforced the message that sibling unions were not only acceptable but sacred. Compared with the monarchies of later centuries, where kings married to build alliances, the Egyptians closed their circle ever tighter. A foreign queen might bring wealth or treaties, but she also brought dilution of blood. A commoner might bear strong children, but they would not carry the divine essence. The court believed purity could only be preserved within. The more confined the circle, the more secure the lineage. And yet, beneath this aura of sanctity, pressure grew heavy. The eldest son bore the greatest weight, for he was expected to unite with his sister as soon as maturity allowed. His worth was measured not in conquest or skill, but in his ability to produce a child with her. His body became a vessel for duty, his desires erased by destiny. The sisters carried their own burden. Each was prepared for her role with instruction, ritual cleansing, and blessings from the priests. To fail in conception was to risk being deemed unworthy. A stillbirth could mark her as lacking divine favor. Success elevated her. Failure diminished her. Within a single family, sisters shifted in status with each birth, each loss. Affection mattered little, fertility determined honor. It is haunting to imagine the stillness of those unions, a brother and sister, their bodies pressed together, not out of love, but out of expectation. Priests standing nearby, their chants filling the air. The moment sacred, yes, but also heavy, burdened by the gaze of eternity. There was no escape, no alternative, no dream of choice. Destiny had already been written on their flesh. Children born of these unions were exalted, presented as flawless embodiments of divine essence. Carved reliefs showed them seated beside their parents' crowns adorning their small heads. They were praised not as fragile infants, but as symbols of perfection. Yet behind this public image lay a private truth. Some of these children were frail, their bodies bearing the hidden cost of repeated inbreeding. But within the palace, such truths were silenced. Rituals erased reality, presenting only the image of eternity. To the Egyptians, incest carried no sense of moral failure. It carried reverence. It was woven into myth, inscribed in stone, enacted in ritual. It was not hidden. It was displayed. The very walls of temples bore witness to these unions, sanctifying them as reflections of divine order. For the people there was no doubt. Their rulers were not merely kings and queens. They were embodiments of gods, their unions, symbols of balance and continuity. Over centuries, this system endured unchallenged. Even as the genetic cost became evident in frail heirs and shortened lives, the ritual remained stronger than evidence. To question it was to question the gods themselves, and so the cycle turned as generation after generation, siblings bound not by affection but by destiny, their lives consumed by the demand to preserve a divine line. In this way, sibling marriages in Egypt became more than unions. They became a philosophy, a theology, a pillar of belief. They blurred the boundary between human desire and sacred duty, dissolving the personal into the cosmic. And while to us they may seem unsettling, to the Egyptians, they were the purest expression of devotion, the joining of bloodlines, the fulfillment of myth, the preservation of eternity. As the lamps dimmed in palace chambers, as siblings lay together beneath painted ceilings, their intimacy was never their own. It belonged to Egypt, to the gods, to the endless demand that the divine line remain unbroken. In the still air of the palace nurseries, where linen curtains swayed gently and incense clung to the walls, royal children were more than sons and daughters. They were living symbols, embodiments of the divine order, reminders that the blood of the gods continued to flow through Egypt's throne. Every gesture they made, every breath they took, was observed not as a child's act, but as a sign from heaven. When a child was born to a royal sibling marriage, the palace did not see an infant in swaddling cloth. It saw a manifestation of eternity. Priests surrounded the newborn with chants praising its eyes as radiant, its breath as divine, its limbs as perfect, even if the body bore frailty. Carved reliefs soon followed, showing the child seated beside its parents, crowned with miniature diadems, the symbols of kingship already resting upon its small head. These images were not intimate portraits, they were declarations. The child was presented not to family but to the nation. Walls of temples displayed the likenesses of royal sons and daughters, their presence proof that the line of Horus remained unbroken. Inscriptions praised them as pure of blood, beloved of the gods, whether or not their health reflected such praise. The pressure fell most heavily upon the firstborn. From the moment of his birth, he was hailed as heir, his cries interpreted as omens, his first steps recorded with ritual precision. His life was not his own, it belonged to Egypt. His education was structured, his meals monitored, his interactions guided by servants and priests. He played not with ordinary children, but with his siblings and cousins, who were destined to be his consorts or supporters. The daughters, too, were raised under this weight. Their bodies became vessels of lineage long before they understood their roles. When they were still young, priests whispered blessings over their cradles, declaring that their wombs carried the promise of eternity. As they grew, their beauty was compared to goddesses, their posture praised as signs of divine favor. They were symbols before they were women, prepared not for choice but for duty. Inside the palace, this symbolic existence shaped every detail of their lives. Toys given to royal children were not simple amusements, but sacred miniatures, tiny scepters, model boats, carved animals linked to deities. Even their games were guided by ritual, meaning rehearsals for the roles they would one day perform. A girl might pretend to pour water into a basin, practicing the gesture she would later perform as queen in temple rites. A boy might mimic lifting a crook and flail, training his body for kingship long before his mind could grasp it. Yet beneath the golden images and sacred toys lay the reality of fragility. Many children born of closed bloodlines suffered illnesses or deformities. Some were born with clubbed feet, fused toes, or elongated skulls. Others lived only days or weeks. But in Egypt, such realities were not spoken of openly. When a child died, its body was wrapped in linen, placed in a small coffin, painted with stars, and buried with amulets as though it had lived a full and sacred life. The loss was explained as divine will, the soul recalled by the gods. Grief was hidden beneath ritual sorrow absorbed into hymns. Those who survived carried themselves differently from ordinary children. Their lives were enclosed within palace walls, their contact with the outside world carefully restricted. No playmates from beyond the royal circle. No laughter shared with village children. Their world was built of stone halls, perfumed chambers, and constant observation. Every movement mattered. Every smile could be read as a blessing. Every silence could be interpreted as an omen. The isolation deepened as they grew older. A young prince did not court friends. He cultivated priests and advisors. A young princess did not wander freely. She was prepared for her future role as consort, her every step rehearsed as ritual. They belonged not to themselves, but to the divine order. Even their dreams were recorded by temple scribes, interpreted for signs of cosmic meaning. In art, these children were flawless. Their images showed symmetrical faces, strong limbs, serene expressions. Reliefs praised their perfection, hiding frailty behind the chisel. The gap between image and reality widened with each generation. Yet the people believed what they saw on the walls, not what lay hidden in chambers. For them, the children of the Pharaohs were untouchable symbols, radiant proof that Egypt remained blessed. And so the children bore the heaviest weight of all to live as symbols. Their gestures were never their own. Their words belonged to the priests who recorded them. Their futures belonged to the dynasty, to the gods, to the throne. In this way, childhood in the royal household was less about innocence and more about representation. The laughter of a boy or girl was not simply laughter, it was reassurance to a nation that the divine line endured. It is haunting to picture a small child barely able to walk dressed in miniature regalia, presented before the court. Servants steadying his steps, priests chanting blessings, courtiers bowing low. The boy does not understand, but everyone else does. He is no longer just a child, he is Egypt's future, a vessel of eternity. Even in death, their symbolism did not end. A baby's coffin was adorned with stars and lotuses, its small body wrapped as carefully as a king's. A child who lived only weeks was still praised in inscriptions, its soul believed to be chosen for another realm. Fragility became mystery, weakness became divine will. The cycle continued, sustained by ritual hidden behind silence. Royal children then were never ordinary. They were never allowed to stumble to play without meaning, to live without weight. They were born into a system that saw them as signs first, as people second. Their lives were gilded, exalted, but also bound. They belonged to Egypt, to the gods, to the eternal story of lineage and purity. In the dim stillness of the palace, as nurses rocked them to sleep, their lullabies were not songs of comfort, but chants of destiny. Even their dreams, though unseen, were heavy with expectation, and so they slept not as children, but as symbols of perfection, fragile bodies carrying the eternal burden of divine blood. Within the high-walled palaces of ancient Egypt, where incense lingered in the air and the footsteps of servants echoed softly across stone floors, the women of the royal household bore a burden that stretched far beyond themselves. Their bodies carried the weight of dynasties, their wombs entrusted with the continuation of divine blood. To conceive, to carry, to give birth, these were not private matters of family and desire. They were the pillars upon which the throne itself rested. From the moment of maturity, a royal woman was measured by her fertility. Her worth was not decided by wit, by beauty, or even by devotion, but by her ability to conceive and deliver children to the dynasty. Sisters, half-sisters, cousins, all were prepared for this duty. Their lives were shaped by priests and advisors who reminded them that their wombs were not their own. They belonged to Egypt, to the gods, to the eternal continuation of divine lineage. When a sister conceived, her status rose like the Nile in flood. Servants attended her with reverence. Priests chanted blessings over her swelling body. Advisors whispered of omens and prosperity. She was praised as favored by the gods, her womb, a vessel of eternity. But when she failed to conceive, the silence around her grew heavy. Whispers marked her as unblessed, her body seen as a barrier rather than a gift. The birth of a stillborn child was interpreted as divine testing. Priests declared that the gods had chosen to challenge her faith. If her womb remained empty, it was said to be punishment for forgotten transgressions or misaligned stars. Rarely was the burden placed upon the men. It was the woman who bore responsibility, who absorbed blame, who carried the shadow of failure in silence. In some cases, a sister who could not bear children was quietly removed from the palace. She might be sent to a distant estate, her presence erased from the rhythm of court life. In other instances, she remained in the palace, but was reduced to the background, her role supplanted by a younger sibling, whose body proved fertile. Among royal women, hierarchy was never fixed. It shifted with each pregnancy, each miscarriage, each birth. Status was fragile, tied entirely to the rhythms of the womb. The queen mother herself, once chosen as a sister wife, often held enormous influence in these matters. She knew the cost, the expectations, the pressure. Having endured it, she now guided the next generation, ensuring that the cycle continued. Her word could elevate a daughter, secure her place beside the pharaoh, or condemn her to silence. Her authority came not from crown or scepter, but from her lived experience, the weight of having been the womb through which Egypt's future once passed. For the pharaoh, choice was rarely his own. Matches were arranged by advisors and priests, sanctioned by tradition, reinforced by divine myth. His wives were selected not for love, but for lineage. His sisters, his cousins, his closest kin, these were his consorts, chosen not by heart, but by duty. Even when affection existed, it was framed as divine design rather than personal desire. In this world, women's bodies became instruments of state. Their cycles were tracked carefully. Their diets were monitored, rich in figs and honey herbs and oils believed to favor conception. Their dreams were recorded, every symbol interpreted for signs of fertility or divine favor. No detail of their lives was left untouched by expectation. Imagine the stillness of a palace chamber. At dawn, a young woman lying awake, her body heavy with hope or grief, attendants whispering prayers at her bedside. If she conceived, the palace would rejoice. If she miscarried, the palace would mourn, but quietly, for mourning too loudly risked casting doubt on divine order. And so sorrow was carried in silence, smoothed over by ritual. For those who succeeded, the burden did not end with birth. A living child was both blessing and test. Each cough, each fever, each restless night carried the weight of destiny. Mothers were reminded constantly that their child was not theirs alone. The infant belonged to Egypt, to the gods, to the eternal story of the throne. A sick child meant omens had shifted, that divine favor hung in question. A healthy child was a sign of prosperity. Either way, the mother bore the blame or the honor. Some royal women endured this cycle repeatedly: pregnancy loss, silence renewal. Their bodies scarred, their hearts heavy, but their duty unrelenting. Few left behind personal words or testimonies, but their presence lingers in records that speak of shifting hierarchies, sudden disappearances, and the rise of younger siblings in their place. Their lives were measured not by years, but by the children they produced or failed to produce. And yet within this system, resilience emerged. Some women learned to navigate the weight with quiet strength. They formed bonds with their sisters, shared whispered prayers, and endured together. Others found solace in rituals that framed their suffering as sacred testing. To endure was to serve. To serve was to fulfill destiny. The palace itself bore witness to their burden. Carvings and paintings showed queens and princesses with serene faces, their bodies stylized into perfection. The truth of their struggles, the miscarriages, the grief. The pain was hidden behind stone and pigment. Publicly, they were radiant vessels of divine order. Privately, they bore the weight of humanity beneath layers of ritual. In this way, royal women became both exalted and diminished. Exalted as vessels of eternity, diminished as individuals. Their worth was bound to their fertility, their lives consumed by the demand to continue the bloodline. Their stories, though rarely written in their own voices, echo still in the silence of tombs and the fragments of records. It is haunting to imagine their world the quiet pressure of expectation, the shifting hierarchies, the isolation within palace walls. Every cycle of their bodies mirrored the cycle of dynasties. Every birth carried the weight of eternity. Every loss was swallowed by ritual silence. For them, childbearing was never simply personal. It was cosmic. It was destiny. And so they lived within that burden, their lives entwined with myth, their bodies bound to Egypt's eternal story, their voices lost in the silence of duty. In the dim corridors of the palace, where the flicker of oil lamps softened the painted walls, one figure held a quiet power that often surpassed the voice of advisors and generals. She was the Queen Mother, the woman who had once been chosen as sister wife, the vessel through which the Pharaoh himself had been born. Though she no longer carried the weight of childbearing, her authority extended far beyond her years of fertility. She became the guardian of the dynasty, the keeper of memory, and the arbiter of destiny within the royal household. Her influence began the moment her son took the throne. As mother of the king, she possessed a sacred legitimacy that no other woman could rival. She had endured the burden of royal duty herself, conceiving within the strict circle of divine blood, surviving pregnancies, miscarriages, and the silence that followed them. She had emerged not only as survivor, but as victor. Her body had succeeded where others had faltered, producing the heir who now wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. For this reason, her word carried extraordinary weight. When decisions arose concerning which sister would be elevated to the role of great royal wife, the Queen Mother's counsel was sought. She knew the rivalries among her daughters and nieces. She understood whose womb had proven fertile, whose temper was steady, whose presence would strengthen the throne. Her choices shaped the private world of the king, ensuring that the cycle of sibling marriages continued without disruption. In many cases, her authority was subtle, exercised through whispers in the right ears, nods exchanged in the silence of temple chambers, or glances that carried more command than spoken words. But beneath the subtlety lay immense power. A woman chosen by the Queen Mother could rise overnight from obscurity to the highest place beside the king. A woman overlooked could fade into silence her chambers, relocated, her attendants reassigned. The Queen Mother also played a vital role in sustaining ritual. Having endured the same ceremonies herself, she ensured that her daughters followed the same path. She reminded them that sorrow, miscarriages, or failure to conceive were not excuses but tests from the gods. She urged silence, resilience, and acceptance. In her presence, grief was acknowledged but never voiced. She had walked the same path, and her authority came from surviving it. Beyond family matters, her influence stretched into politics. Pharaohs often ascended the throne young, untested, sometimes unsteady. In those early years, it was the Queen Mother who guided them. She attended councils not always as speaker, but as presence. Advisors bowed lower in her company, priests deferred to her knowledge of tradition. She was the living link between past and present, carrying the authority of memory that few dared question. Her chambers within the palace reflected this role. They were not adorned with the frivolities of youth, but with symbols of power, amulets of Hathor, carvings of Isis, nursing Horus reminders that motherhood was sacred in Egypt, not only for its tenderness, but for its ability to sustain the state itself. Her presence in ritual processions carried the same weight as a general leading an army. When she walked beside her son, the people saw continuity. When she appeared at temple offerings, they saw divine approval. Yet her power was not absolute. It was balanced on the fragile axis of fertility and memory. If her daughters failed to conceive, whispers of divine disfavor might reach even her. If her son faltered, as king advisors might look to her for blame as much as for guidance. And so she too lived within the burden of expectation, her influence tethered to the wombs of her daughters and the success of her son. It is possible to imagine her at night sitting in quiet chambers perfumed with lotus, reviewing reports from servants, recalling her own years as great wife, weighing decisions that would shape the dynasty. Around her, the palace slept, but her mind remained restless, calculating which alliances to preserve, which rivalries to silence, which daughter to raise. Her authority was not loud, not dramatic. It was constant steady of force woven into the very fabric of the court. There are records of queens who used this power to ensure the continuity of the dynasty. Some persuaded their sons to take multiple sisters as wives, increasing the chances of a healthy heir. Others arranged marriages between cousins to weave branches of the family ever closer. In every case, the Queen Mother acted not from personal affection but from devotion to lineage. Her life had been shaped by duty, and she ensured that duty endured through the next generation. Her role also extended to the spiritual. As the mother of the living God, she herself was elevated to near-divine status. Temples sometimes depicted her alongside deities, her image carved into walls where she offered milk or protection to her son. In these depictions, she was not simply a woman. She was the embodiment of maternal divinity, her authority sanctified by myth. And yet behind the grandeur, the Queen Mother remained bound by the same silence as the other royal women. Her personal griefs were hidden. Her sacrifices were never spoken of. Her influence, though immense, was exercised within the confines of ritual and duty. She did not escape the system, she embodied it. In this way, the Queen Mother stood at the center of power, both exalted and constrained. She was revered as the guardian of lineage, yet she too lived within the silence of ritual, her voice powerful only when it served the cycle of divine blood. Her authority was vast, but it was not her own. It belonged to Egypt, to the gods, to the throne. As the lamps dimmed in her chambers and servants withdrew into shadow, the Queen Mother's presence remained steady. She carried within her the weight of generations, the memory of rituals endured, the knowledge of sorrow hidden beneath gold. Her authority was not written in decrees or laws. It was carved into the fabric of dynasty itself, an authority born from the womb, sustained by silence and sanctified by the gods. In the grand courts of ancient Egypt, where painted columns rose like forests of stone, and every corner shimmered with incense smoke, marriage was never a matter of affection. It was arithmetic. It was strategy. It was survival of the divine bloodline. For a pharaoh, to take one sister as wife was duty. To take several was necessity. This practice was not driven by desire but by calculation. The royal line depended upon children, and children depended upon chance. Each pregnancy carried risk of miscarriage, of stillbirth, of frailty. To entrust the future of the dynasty to a single womb was too great a gamble. And so some pharaohs accepted multiple sisters as wives, binding them all in one closed circle, each bearing the same sacred blood. The palace adjusted itself around this arrangement. Sisters lived in adjacent quarters, their chambers connected by corridors lined with guards and attendants. Each had her own household of servants, her own retinue, her own duties. Yet they were bound together in competition as much as in kinship. The measure of their worth lay not in jewels or whispers of affection, but in the health of the children they bore. Their cycles were tracked meticulously by priests. Servants recorded the rhythms of their bodies, noting signs of fertility, preparing rituals when conception seemed favorable. Meals were carefully managed, figs and honey for strength, herbs believed to warm the womb, wine infused with lotus to calm the mind. Even dreams were collected. A sister who dreamed of water flowing was said to be ready. A sister who dreamed of stones falling was warned of miscarriage. Nothing was left to chance. When one conceived, the palace rejoiced. Her chambers were filled with incense, her garments dyed in auspicious colors. If she delivered a child, her status rose above the others. If she miscarried or her infant died, her position weakened, and another sister stepped forward to take her place. The hierarchy among wives shifted, constantly fluid, as the Nile each pregnancy altering the balance of power. For the pharaoh, this system was both reassurance and burden. Surrounded by wives who were also his sisters, he bore the weight of duty on every side. His bedchamber was not a place of intimacy, but of expectation. His queens were not companions of choice, but symbols of blood. With each union, he was reminded not of personal desire, but of obligation to gods and state. The Queen Mother often presided over this arrangement. Having once lived as chosen sister wife herself, she ensured that competition among daughters remained contained. She counseled them to accept the shifting tides of status, to endure silence to focus on producing heirs? Her word kept rivalries from erupting her presence, reminding all that what mattered was not personal pride, but continuation of lineage. Imagine the stillness of the palace at night, sisters in separate chambers, each waiting, each hoping to carry the next heir. Lamps flicker in quiet corridors, servants pass silently with trays of offerings, and the air hums with expectation. Beneath the calm surface lies tension, every birth of victory, every loss a fall from grace. In art and inscription, however, this reality was never shown. Reliefs displayed harmony, not rivalry. Sisters appeared side by side, serene, their children seated between them. Inscriptions praised them equally, their wombs described as fertile fields, their bodies as vessels of eternity. The truth of shifting status was hidden behind stone, replaced with the illusion of balance and divine unity. The Pharaoh's children, born of multiple sisters, grew up together in the same palace wings, their lives intertwined but layered with subtle hierarchies. A son born to the favored sister was honored more than one born to a less successful wife. A daughter's value rose or fell with her mother's standing. The children themselves may not have understood these distinctions in youth, but the court did. Their lives too were measured by the wombs from which they came. This system carried heavy costs. The genetic consequences of repeated unions within the family began to reveal themselves more clearly with each generation. Some children were frail, their bodies weakened, their lives short. Others bore visible deformities. Yet ritual absorbed these consequences, explaining them as divine mysteries, disguising them as tests from the gods. The cycle continued unbroken, sustained not by evidence of success, but by the weight of belief. For the sisters themselves, the arrangement was both honor and prison. To be chosen as wife to the pharaoh was the highest elevation a woman of the royal family could attain. Yet the honor came bound in silence, in rivalry, and endless pressure to conceive. Their lives were reduced to the rhythms of fertility, their identities consumed by the roles assigned to them. Some endured with quiet resilience, finding solace in ritual and belief. Others carried bitterness beneath the surface, though it was never voiced. Their struggles remain invisible in the records, their voices lost in silence. What survives are only traces, fragments of prayers, inscriptions of blessings, images of serene faces carved in stone. It is haunting to reflect on this world where family ties were both intimate and strategic, where sisters became rivals for survival, where love had little place beside duty. The palace was not simply a home, it was a stage where divine lineage was performed, maintained, and secured at any cost. Through multiple sisters as wives, Egypt sought to ensure continuity to protect the purity of divine blood to keep the throne untouchable. And though the cost was heavy, though the fragility of children and the silence of women bore witness to the strain the cycle endured, ritual absorbed the cracks, belief smoothed the fractures. The system held generation after generation, its truth buried beneath gold, its burden carried in silence. Within the labyrinth of the Egyptian palace, where corridors stretched into shadow and sunlight rarely touched the inner courts, royal children grew up in a world apart. Their lives were bound not only by privilege, but by walls, their days marked by ritual and observation rather than freedom. To be born into divine blood was to inherit both exaltation and confinement. From their earliest moments, these children were surrounded by attendants. Nurses, tutors, and priests hovered constantly, ensuring that no gesture, no cry went unnoticed. The infants of the royal household were never left alone. Their small cradles were set in chambers perfumed with myrrh and cooled with woven fans. Even their lullabies carried meaning chants that invoked Hathor or Isis, words that reminded the child, even in sleep, that they belonged to the gods before they belonged to themselves. Unlike children of common households, they had no playmates beyond their siblings and cousins. The risk of mingling with outsiders was unthinkable. To let the divine bloodline brush against the ordinary was to invite dilution, doubt, and danger. And so their world was narrow, confined to polished courtyards, shaded gardens, and the painted chambers of the palace. Their games were watched, their words noted, their gestures interpreted as omens. Each child was treated as more than human. A smile could be recorded as a sign of divine favor. A sudden cry might be explained as a warning from the gods. Their bodies were draped in miniature garments woven of fine linen, their heads adorned with small circlets or amulets shaped like scarabs. Every detail of their lives became symbol. They were not allowed to stumble as ordinary children do. Their missteps were softened by servants, their falls prevented by careful hands. The isolation shaped their minds as much as their bodies. Surrounded by walls watched by priests, they learned early that their lives were not their own. Lessons began almost as soon as they could sit upright. A boy might be handed a small crook and flail miniature symbols of kingship and taught to hold them properly before he could even form words. A girl might be guided to pour water into a basin, rehearsing gestures she would one day perform as queen in temple rituals. Childhood was not play, it was preparation. Meals, too, were arranged as ritual. The children sat in order of rank, their food carefully chosen to align with temple prescriptions. Honey cakes, dates, and milk flavored with herbs were offered at certain times, believed to strengthen body and spirit alike. Every act of nourishment was treated as symbolic. To eat was to sustain the divine order. To sleep was to dream under the gaze of the gods. Yet beneath the layers of ritual and privilege, fragility lingered. Many of these children born of closed bloodlines carried hidden weaknesses. Some walked with difficulty, their steps shortened or uneven. Others spoke late, their voices quiet and strained. But in the palace, these signs were never acknowledged. Pain was smoothed over with ritual frailty concealed by the calm precision of ceremony. When illness struck, priests surrounded the child with incense and chants invoking divine healing. If the child recovered, it was proclaimed a miracle. If the child died, the loss was reframed as a calling of the gods. Grief was never allowed to appear as failure. Even death was absorbed into ritual, presented not as sorrow, but as sacred necessity. Inscriptions carved on temple walls reinforced this illusion. Reliefs showed royal children as perfect, serene, their bodies unmarked by frailty. They were depicted standing proudly beside their parents' miniature crowns upon their heads, gestures precise and divine. The truth of their isolation, their fragility, their struggles was erased from stone. What remained was the image of perfection. It is haunting to imagine these children at dusk, standing in balconies above palace courtyards, gazing outward, but never stepping beyond. They could see the city below the markets, the laughter of common children, the bustle of daily life, but those sounds remained distant, unreachable. Their world was smaller, quieter, shaped by silence and ritual expectation. As they grew older, the isolation deepened. A young prince preparing for kingship was guided by priests in private chambers, taught chants, taught to read omens, taught that his voice carried divine authority. A young princess destined for her brother's bed, and the cycle of lineage was prepared with blessings, purification rituals, and silent lessons about her body's role. They were raised as vessels of eternity, not as individuals. Even their dreams were not their own. When a child spoke of visions seen in the night, priests recorded the words, carefully interpreting them as divine messages. A simple dream of water flowing might be declared a sign of fertility. A dream of darkness might be seen as warning. The child's inner life became another arena for ritual, stripped of privacy, transformed into prophecy. Through all of this, the children were adored. They were pampered, dressed in the finest linen, surrounded by music and scent. Yet the adoration was not truly for them, it was for what they represented. They were symbols of continuity, proof that the gods remained with Egypt, reminders that the throne stood unbroken. Their isolation was the cost of embodying that symbol. It is possible to picture a child sitting silently in a painted chamber, attendants brushing scented oil into her hair, her eyes wide with questions she never spoke aloud. Outside the city lived freely families gathering, children playing. Inside, her world was narrowed to ritual expectation and silence. Royal children lived lives gilded with beauty, yet weighted with confinement. They were adored, yet imprisoned, exalted, yet watched. Their isolation was not punishment, but preservation, the price of divine blood. To the court, it was necessity. To the children themselves, it was life ordinary, unchallenged, unquestioned. And so they grew not as individuals, but as symbols. Their laughter became ritual. Their tears became omens. Their very presence became proof that Egypt remained favored. In their isolation, they carried the burden of eternity, silent heirs to a cycle that bound them from cradle to tomb. Behind the gilded doors of the Egyptian palace, beneath painted ceilings where gods gazed down with unblinking eyes, lay a truth that was never carved openly into stone. The children of divine unions conceived between brothers and sisters, between close kin, bound by ritual duty, were often fragile. Their bodies bore the hidden cost of blood kept too tightly within its circle. Yet this fragility was never admitted, never spoken beyond whispers. It was absorbed into ritual, disguised by art explained away as the will of the gods. Archaeology has revealed what inscriptions concealed. In the mummies of princes and princesses, the marks of strain are visible spines, curved, unnaturally limbs, twisted skulls, elongated or misshapen. Some children bore cleft palates. Others showed evidence of clubfoot or fused bones. Tutankhamun himself, remembered for his golden mask and treasure-filled tomb, carried the weight of this legacy. His body revealed frailties and malformed foot signs of illness, the imprint of repeated inbreeding carried silently through generations. But in their own time, such truths were hidden. Reliefs showed royal children as flawless. Their profiles were smooth, their bodies straight, their expressions serene. No sign of weakness appeared in the art that covered temple walls. To admit imperfection would have been to admit that the bloodline itself, believed to be divine, could falter, and so the chisels erased truth, leaving only idealized images of strength and purity. The fragility of these children was managed through ritual. A child who limped was carried in processions presented to the people as though his stillness were majesty. A daughter who struggled to move with grace was shown in carvings standing tall beside her parents, her deformities erased by paint and stone. Priests interpreted weakness not as failure but as mystery. A child's frailty became a sacred sign, a hidden message from the gods, to be revered rather than pitied. Within the palace, however, the burden was heavy. Mothers watched as their children coughed through long nights, their bodies too weak to endure. Some saw infant after infant laid in small coffins, wrapped in linen, buried with amulets as though they had lived full lives. The sorrow was profound, but it was never allowed to surface. Grief was swallowed in silence, explained away in hymns. Each loss was framed as a divine choice, each frailty as sacred mystery. The pressure on surviving children was immense. A prince born with deformity still carried the expectation of kingship. His limp was ignored in instruction. His crooked body was wrapped in golden garments and presented as living proof of divine continuity. Every breath he took was an act of endurance, a reminder that destiny outweighed flesh. His weaknesses did not lessen the burden placed upon him, they intensified it. For the sisters, the pressure was equally harsh. A daughter born frail was still destined for marriage within the family, her womb still expected to bear the next heir. If she struggled with health, it was interpreted as divine testing, not as failure of bloodline. Her life was measured by her ability to endure, to conceive, to continue the cycle even when her body faltered. Whispers of deformities rarely left palace walls, but they shaped hierarchies within. A mother whose child thrived, even briefly, rose in status. A mother whose children failed, weakened in influence. These shifts were constant, painful, and often unjust, yet they kept the cycle turning. It is haunting to imagine the quiet sorrow of those chambers, a small boy with twisted foot practicing to hold the crook, and flail servants steadying him as priests chant hymns. A young girl, frail and pale, sitting among attendants who braid her hair, preparing her for rituals she may never live to perform. Their fragility hidden behind ceremony, their humanity dissolved into symbol. Death among royal children was frequent, but even in death their fragility was concealed. Coffins were adorned with stars, their names inscribed in prayers, their souls praised as pure. Nowhere did inscriptions speak of weakness. Nowhere did they admit deformity. To the people, the royal children remained perfect eternal embodiments of divine purity. The truth was buried with them, hidden for millennia until uncovered by modern science. And yet, despite the cost the system endured, incestuous unions continued, justified by myth, sustained by ritual, reinforced by the Queen Mother and advisors. Fragility was not seen as evidence against the system, but as proof of divine mystery. The more the children suffered, the more their suffering was absorbed into sacred narrative. Egypt did not abandon its practice. It endured unbroken generation after generation. This endurance reveals the depth of belief. The Egyptians trusted their myths more than their eyes. They chose ritual over reality, eternity over evidence. Fragile children did not shake their faith, they strengthened it, reminding them that the gods worked in ways beyond human understanding. It is a solemn thought to picture these children asleep in perfumed chambers, their bodies fragile, their breaths shallow, yet their presence revered as divine. They were loved, but loved as symbols, not as individuals. Their fragility was real, but it was hidden behind incense and hymns. Their deformities were human, but they were covered with gold. In this way, the children of Egypt's royal line bore the heaviest burden of all. They carried within their frail bodies the cost of purity, the price of belief. Their lives were brief, their suffering silent, their humanity hidden. Yet through them the illusion of eternity endured, carved into stone, painted onto temple walls, preserved in ritual silence. They were fragile yet eternal, broken yet divine, human yet symbols. And in their silence, Egypt's myth remained unbroken. Within the sanctuaries of Egypt's temples, behind walls, thick with incense and chants that echoed through painted halls, the priests stood as guardians of more than ritual. They managed the fertility of the royal household itself, watching over the wombs of queens and the bodies of kings with the same scrutiny they gave to sacred statues and temple offerings. For in Egypt, fertility was not private, it was political, cosmic, and eternal. Every royal union, every conception, every birth was woven into the priestly system of oversight. They tracked the cycles of the queens with the precision of astronomers mapping stars. Servants brought daily reports, the rhythms of blood, the changes in appetite, the flow of dreams. Each sign was recorded, each omen weighed. If the Nile rose predictably, if the stars aligned with certain constellations, priests declared it an auspicious time for union. When omens were dark, abstinence was ordered even within the pharaoh's chambers. Meals prepared for royal women were arranged according to priestly instruction. Honey was prescribed to sweeten the womb, figs to strengthen the body, herbs believed to stir fertility mixed into wine. Bathing rituals were ordered at certain phases of the moon, oils rubbed into skin to draw divine favor. Nothing was left to chance. To the priest, the female body was not her own. It was the altar upon which Egypt's future rested, and they its custodians. When conception was delayed, the priest turned to ritual intervention. Sacred amulets were tied to the arms of queens, charms shaped like frogs or lotuses placed beneath their pillows. Incantations were whispered into their ears as they slept, urging fertility into their dreams. If these failed, stronger measures were used. Ritual baths infused with herbs were administered at dawn, the women immersed in water while chants rose around them. The body was washed not for cleansing, but for renewal, as though water itself could coax life into being. When conception occurred, the priests declared it divine success. They offered thanks to Hathor, goddess of fertility, and to Isis, mother of Horus. Offerings of milk, honey, and flowers filled temple altars. The pregnancy became more than biological, it became cosmic proof that the gods favored Egypt. And when birth drew near, priests prepared charms and chants to ensure safe delivery, invoking divine midwives to guard the passage from womb to world. Yet when pregnancies ended in miscarriage or when infants died in infancy, the priests absorbed the failure into ritual silence. The loss was not acknowledged as weakness of blood or error of practice. It was explained as divine choice, the gods reclaiming what was theirs. Funerary rites for stillborns and infants were rich with ceremony, small coffins, painted with stars, amulets laid gently across linen wrappings, prayers offered to guide the soul into eternity. The priest reframed every loss as mystery, every grief as sacred will. Their management extended also to the pharaoh himself. His role in fertility was not left to instinct or desire. Priests declared when he must visit his queens, when his body was ritually prepared for union, when abstinence was required to preserve sacred cycles. Baths, ointments, and rituals of purification surrounded him, ensuring that his seed was framed as divine essence, not mortal flesh. Even his dreams were read for signs of potency or weakness. If he dreamed of falcons soaring, priests proclaimed, "Fertility strong." If he dreamed of barren deserts, warnings were given, rituals intensified. Thus, the royal marriage bed was not private, it was a temple in itself, its rhythms directed by priestly command. The intimacy between pharaoh and queen, dissolved into public duty, watched over by invisible eyes of ritual, charted by the pens of scribes, sanctified by chants that filled the air. Over time, this priestly oversight created a strange paradox. On one hand, it reinforced the divine aura of kingship. Births were celebrated as cosmic victories, proof that gods favored Egypt. On the other hand, it concealed the human cost, the miscarriages, the frailties, the sorrow of queens who carried burden after burden. Their pain was absorbed into ritual, their voices silenced beneath chants. And yet the system endured, for it served both palace and temple alike. The palace gained legitimacy through priestly blessing. The temple gained authority by managing the most intimate aspects of royal life. The balance was mutually reinforcing. Without priestly management, the bloodline might falter. Without the bloodline, the temples might lose their claim to sacred authority. Together they formed an unbreakable cycle. It is haunting to imagine a scene: a queen lying in her chamber, her body weary from repeated pregnancy's attendance, whispering prayers at her side. Priests enter quietly, their voices rising in chants, their hands placing amulets on her skin. She closes her eyes, her grief unspoken, her duty unrelenting. Outside, the palace waits for news: another child to be celebrated, or another silence to be explained away. The priests recorded both outcomes with equal precision. A living child was inscribed as a blessing, a dead one as a divine mystery. In either case, the system remained intact. No event, however painful, could undermine the structure of belief. The gods, the bloodline, and the throne were always preserved. In this way, priestly management of royal fertility transformed human life into sacred narrative. Every body became a vessel, every birth an omen, every loss a ritual. The private became public, the personal became political, the human dissolved into myth. The cost was borne in silence by women and children, but the cycle endured unbroken. And so, within Egypt's palaces, fertility was never simply about life. It was about eternity. It was about the god's will, the throne's survival, the people's faith. The priests with their chants and records ensured that the cycle continued, cloaked in ritual, hidden from questions, sustained for generations. Within the painted chambers of Egypt's royal palaces, where murals told endless stories of gods and kings, one presence remained almost entirely absent: the voices of women themselves. Their images appeared in relief, serene, and adorned their names carved into stone. But their words, their thoughts, their griefs and longings are scarcely found in the records. The silence of royal women was not accidental. It was part of the system, woven deliberately into the fabric of ritual and rule. The queen's sisters and daughters of pharaohs lived lives shaped by duty. They bore the burden of lineage, their bodies treated as vessels of continuity. When they succeeded in conceiving and giving birth, their names were praised in inscriptions, their faces painted beside their husbands. When they failed, their presence quietly diminished, their roles passed to other sisters. But in either case, their voices were not recorded. Their words were not preserved. Their silence became the language through which the system maintained itself. This silence extended even to grief. When a child was stillborn, the palace performed ceremonies of divine acceptance. Priests explained the loss as the gods reclaiming what was theirs. Mothers were expected to submit, to bow their heads, to endure without question. Their tears may have fallen in private, but their voices did not reach inscriptions. Their sorrow was swallowed by ritual. Even when queens held great influence as mothers of kings, as great royal wives, their power was expressed not through words but through presence. They appeared in processions radiant and adorned their serenity proof of divine order. They sat beside the pharaoh in reliefs, their hands resting calmly at their sides, their faces composed. They stood as symbols of harmony even when rivalry and suffering pressed heavily behind the scenes. The system did not allow them to speak because their voices might have revealed cracks. To confess sorrow, to admit rivalry, to protest against duty, would have drawn attention to the cost of the bloodline system. Silence erased that cost. Silence preserved the illusion of perfection. It is haunting to imagine the moments that went unrecorded: a queen whispering her fears to a trusted servant in the dark of night, a sister wife weeping quietly as another rose in status, a mother clutching the lifeless body of her child before it was taken to burial. These moments happened. Human hearts could not be untouched, but the records omit them. What survives is only the serene image, the polished surface, the silence. Even in art, women's identities were often tied to the men they served. They were labeled as wife of the king, mother of the god, daughter of the pharaoh. Their individuality was dissolved into their roles. Their names lived on, but rarely their words. When they prayed, their voices were absorbed into hymns written by priests. When they counseled, their influence passed through gestures, through quiet decisions, through silence that carried authority without breaking ritual. The silence was not only external, it was taught from within. From girlhood, royal daughters were instructed to accept destiny without question. Their bodies were consecrated as vessels long before they matured. Their voices were trained to recite hymns, not to express dissent. They were taught that silence was virtue, that endurance was sacred. To speak against duty was to oppose the gods. And so they learned to withhold words, to live in ritual quiet, to communicate through gestures rather than speech. Priestly records reinforce this. Rituals framed women as passive vessels, receivers of divine seed, mothers of divine children. Their silence was interpreted as purity, their stillness as sanctity. The less they spoke, the more sacred they appeared. Silence itself became part of the performance, proof that they were aligned with the divine order. Yet, silence can also be powerful. In their quiet presence, queens shaped dynasties. A glance, a nod, a moment of stillness could shift hierarchies within the palace. Their counsel, though rarely recorded, influenced decisions made by kings and priests. Their power did not shout, it whispered. It lingered in silence, subtle but enduring. Still, the human cost remains clear. Without their voices, history remembers them only as symbols. Their joys and sorrows, their desires and fears are lost. What remains is the serene image carved in stone, hiding the turmoil beneath. Their silence preserved the system, but it erased their individuality. It is possible to imagine a queen seated in her chamber, attendants braiding her hair, priests waiting at the door. She gazes into a polished bronze mirror, her face reflected in silence. She knows her worth is measured in children, her voice bound by ritual. She may think of her lost infants, of her rival sisters, of her own youth now past. But she speaks none of it. The silence swallows her thoughts as it swallowed those of generations before her. This silence endured even into death. Tombs carried inscriptions of praise, hymns to their roles as mothers of kings, wives of gods. Their images were serene, their names eternal. But their voices, what they thought, what they whispered in private moments, remained buried with them. The system preserved their silence as carefully as it preserved their mummies, embalming not only their bodies but their words. In this way, the silence of women sustained the illusion of harmony. It erased grief, concealed rivalry, absorbed sacrifice. It preserved the myth of divine purity, hiding the cost carried by mothers, sisters, and daughters. Their voices are lost to us, but their silence speaks still. It tells us of a system so rigid, so consuming that even words could not escape it. And so, in the quiet halls of the palace, amid incense and painted stone, the voices of women were hushed. Their lives were lived in service, their individuality dissolved into duty. They endured in silence, carried the burden of lineage in silence, and passed into eternity in silence. And through that silence, Egypt's myth endured unbroken, serene, eternal. When the last flames of a dynasty dimmed, when temples grew quiet and the walls of palaces began to crumble, what remained was not the voices of kings nor the commands of priests, but the memory of rituals. The legacy of Egypt's divine unions was not carved into every wall nor recorded in every scroll, but it lingered all the same. In whispered prayers and fragments of text in the faint images painted within tombs, the union of body and divinity remained a thread woven through centuries of belief. The rituals of Egypt may seem strange to us now, acts of intimacy consecrated in silent ceremonies that joined siblings' rights that demanded surrender from kings. Yet in their own time, they were not seen as oddities. They were the very structure of the sacred world. For the Egyptians, the body was not separate from the divine. Flesh and spirit touched constantly, and rituals of union made that touch visible. To them, every act of creation, whether the rising of the Nile, the birth of a child, or the embrace of two bodies, was part of a single cosmic rhythm. Through these unions, the pharaoh was confirmed as divine, the queen was sanctified as mother, and the lineage of gods was preserved in flesh. The rituals carried a power that was both private and public, both intimate and political. They ensured that each new generation was bound to the divine order, that the throne remained not only a seat of governance, but a place where heaven and earth met. The legacy of these practices is not measured in the rituals themselves, for many faded with time, lost to reform, erased by later faiths, but in the way they shaped the Egyptian imagination. In art, we still see echoes of Pharaoh painted with both masculine and feminine features, a queen depicted with divine crowns, children seated beside their parents as symbols rather than infants. In tombs, we still glimpse fragments of erotic imagery, soft curves, etched into sarcophagi lovers preserved in pigment for eternity. These images remind us that, to the Egyptians, desire and divinity were not opposites, they were allies. The rituals also left a mark in language. In hymns, the words of priests wove metaphors of union. Gods were described as lovers, the heavens as a womb, the earth as a body waiting to be awakened. The vocabulary of fertility, intimacy, and creation seeped into prayers and myths. Even the myths of Osiris and Isis, Horus and Hathor were framed not only as stories of gods, but as patterns for human ritual. Myth became instruction, and instruction became ritual. Over time, as dynasties shifted, some of these unions grew simpler, reduced to prayers or symbolic offerings. Yet the memory lingered. Priests still guarded scrolls that spoke of sacred intimacy. Dancers still echoed gestures of divine coupling in temple festivals. The architecture of secret chambers still held the faint scent of oil, the marks of bare feet upon stone floors. Silence may have claimed the rituals, but the walls remembered. The legacy also carried forward in the way Egyptians viewed death. For them, the afterlife was not only a continuation of power and duty, it was also a continuation of union. Coffins were painted with lovers. Amulets were placed within the body scrolls, depicted positions meant to awaken fertility in eternity. To die was not to lose intimacy. It was to carry it forward, transformed into a bridge between worlds. Even in decline, when foreign rulers took Egypt and temples were abandoned, the memory of divine unions was not erased entirely. Greek and Roman writers carried fragments of the tales, though often misunderstood, rephrased as myth or rumor. Later faiths condemned such practices but could not fully erase the stone. A carving of two figures intertwined remained in a tomb wall. A jar shaped for preservation of essence still sat buried in sand. A symbol scratched into papyrus hinted at rituals long forgotten. The silence preserved the mystery but also allowed traces to survive. In truth, the greatest legacy of these unions lies not in their details but in their philosophy. The Egyptians believed that every bond between people reflected a bond between gods. Marriage was not merely a contract, it was a reenactment of divine order. Intimacy was not private, it was a cosmic act. Birth was not chance, it was destiny. To live was to participate in rituals that stretched back to the dawn of creation. This belief sustained their world. It explained floods and droughts, births and deaths, victories and defeats. It gave meaning to suffering and purpose to desire. In moments when life seemed fragile, when a child died, when a king faltered, when the gods seemed distant, the rituals of union reminded the people that flesh itself could call divinity closer. Through body and breath, they reached for eternity. And so the legacy endures, not in the literal sense for we do not repeat their rituals, but in the way we still seek meaning in our bonds. We still dream of intimacy that transcends the physical, of love that feels eternal, of unions that carry us beyond ourselves. The Egyptians built entire systems of belief upon these longings. We too carry them, though in different forms. As you drift into sleep tonight, imagine those ancient chambers. The faint glow of oil lamps, the soft fragrance of lotus and myrrh, the quiet footsteps across polished stone. Imagine the stillness, the silence broken only by breath. In that silence, the Egyptians believed they touched the divine. Their unions were not simply acts of flesh, but prayers spoken without words. And while their temples have fallen and their rituals have faded, the longing that created them has not. It lingers in us still, the desire to connect, to transcend, to carry love and life beyond the limits of the body. This is the true legacy of divine unions, not the rituals themselves, but the reminder that longing, tenderness, and desire have always been threads binding us to the mystery of existence. Close your eyes and let the quiet of that ancient world wrap around you. The gods have faded, the rituals have vanished, but the human heart with its longing for union beats on. And in that steady rhythm you may find the same peace that once filled the stone chambers of Egypt, where body and divinity touched and silence itself became eternal.